Traditionally, RPGs are a turn-based genre, with allies and enemies alternating who gets to attack whom. In the early days of RPGs, this worked well enough, but not everyone was satisfied with the status quo. And during the Super Nintendo era of RPGs, a lot of entries experimented with new systems to try and keep players engaged beyond just slow menuing. For example, Earthbound had its iconic Health Dicktown system, and Super Mario RPG introduced the world to timed hits. But the most iconic twist on the classic turn-based formula was the ATB, or Active Time Battle system, that debuted in Final Fantasy IV. Under the ATB system, every character, whether it's a party member or an enemy, has their own internal clock that is constantly ticking upwards. Once the ATB meter fills, that character gets to take an action. If it's an enemy, they will automatically perform whatever their next attack will be. If it's a party member, the player gets access to the combat window and can choose between a variety of commands such as attack, items, spells, or special abilities. FF4's lead designer, Takashi Tokita, says that the active time battle mechanics were there out of a desire to add realism to the games, which were otherwise pretty static and unrealistic. Now, personally, I've never been a fan of adding realism to games for realism's sake, but thankfully, the ATB system has quite a few positives to offer beyond realism. The most immediately apparent is the use of speed makes enemies and allies have a greater degree of variability. It's possible to include super fast characters that get a lot of actions, and contrast them with incredibly slow characters that get fewer actions but have higher impact turns. Moreover, abilities that adjust a character's speed, such as haste and slow, can be a big part of the combat system, as extra actions are always a huge net positive. On a more granular level, the ATB system opens up the possibility of giving specific powerful actions a charge time, and this can lead to interesting tactical considerations beyond simply spamming your most powerful or cost-efficient ability. The other major benefit the ATB system brings to an RPG is one that I'm hesitant to label as a strict upside. You see, the ATB system ticks forward at all times, and as such, instead of the standard turn-based system where you can take your time making decisions and executing commands, you need to constantly be paying attention, make decisions as quickly as possible, and navigate menus at a relatively quick pace. Otherwise, you might find yourself suffering additional unnecessary attacks, and in the worst case scenario, you can have a character get killed while you are menuing and therefore forfeit their turn. And this can make battles feel quite tense, especially in situations where victory and defeat are equally likely. When you pull off a narrow success like this, it can feel like you and the characters worked in tandem, and it's really satisfying. But I'll be honest, I'm a bit of a hater when it comes to this aspect of the ATB system. Fast menuing is just not something that's especially satisfying for me. If I want to test my reflexes, I'll play an action game, not an RPG. It's also worth noting that the inability to turn off these timers serves as a barrier for those with neurological or cognitive disorders that might require extra time to input commands or simply decide what they want to do. Later entries in the series would add wait mode, an option that caused the ATB timers to pause whenever you are in the spell or item menus, but this is a weird halfway point, because the timer still ticks when you're not inside a submenu, so if you need to switch between different submenus or just take some time deciding on what command you're going to pick, you still end up losing time to the ATB gauge, which is just a really weird decision. It's like a strange half measure that I can't imagine makes anyone happy. The people who want to menu as quickly as possible aren't going to bother with wait mode, and people like me who aren't interested in fast menuing still have to deal with it half the time. In order to try to fully grasp the ATB system, I did 2 separate playthroughs of FF4. The one on the original SNES forced me to use action mode, whereas when I played a remake, I tested out wait mode to see how different it felt. And I noticed the pause a little bit whenever I was casting spells or searching for items, but I still found myself frustrated with needing to quickly menu around if I was choosing to kick or aim or any other action that is located on the main menu which didn't pause things. Ultimately, this was a small piece of friction because Final Fantasy IV is both an incredibly easy and quite simple game, but I think that simplicity is in part because of the ATB system. Since the game's combat system was designed with the idea that players would need to make decisions and menu around quickly, they didn't give characters too many different options. After all, the more complexities and synergies you add into a combat system, the longer it's going to take players to decide on exactly which actions they want to take and in what order. As such, the presence of the ATB timer feels like it creates a natural ceiling on just how complex characters' movesets can be. Although, funny enough, the ATB system isn't the biggest hurdle in the way of character complexity. And in fact, most versions of Final Fantasy IV feature what I would say is the most complex cast of characters we've had in the franchise so far. But unfortunately, if you were a child growing up in the 90s outside of Japan, you didn't get access to most versions of Final Fantasy IV. And that brings me to the awkward part about this video: FF4's horrible international release. For those unaware, Final Fantasy II and Final Fantasy III were not initially released outside of Japan. And as such, the 4th Final Fantasy was actually referred to as Final Fantasy II in international releases. And this makes a certain amount of sense in a pre-internet age. I think it would be really confusing for little Timmy age 9 if Final Fantasy I and Final Fantasy IV existed, but 2 and 3 just were not available at his local game store. It's similar to how Fire Emblem 7 was simply known as Fire Emblem in the West, because it was the first Fire Emblem that we got. But while the title change was, in my opinion, the correct choice at the time, everything else that Nintendo of America altered feels like a noticeable step down. The translation itself was noticeably clunky and lacked a lot of the emotionality of Final Fantasy IV's story, and that's before factoring in that much of the game's story was actually censored. Nintendo of America at the time had a policy of eliminating any religious or otherwise sensitive elements, mostly due to a fear of offending America's predominantly Christian audience. And as such, elements of Cecil's story with Christ-like imagery or violent language were cut or severely altered. And since Final Fantasy IV's story and gameplay were intimately related, this means not only was the story impacted, but the gameplay itself was altered. Things like Cecil's self-harming darkness ability or Rosa's pray command were entirely cut. And this also applies to some seemingly mundane abilities, such as Fusoya's regen or Yang's focus and brace commands. This is in part because the Western release of Final Fantasy IV was developed alongside the Final Fantasy IV Easy type version, which was meant to simplify combat. So maybe they just thought Americans were too stupid to handle the complexity in FF4, but either way, it results in an inferior gameplay and story experience. And even outside of instances where things are explicitly censored or dummied down, the translation itself was just really sloppy. There's the iconic Spoony Bard line, of course, but even less egregious translation issues just come off as excessively stilted and failed to convey the emotions the team was going for. Even high-level employees of Square Enix agreed that this was a bad translation and have publicly stated as much, which is the reason why future remakes got a revamp and retranslation that altered almost every aspect of the thing. And I think that's a pretty big shame because Final Fantasy IV's story is, in my opinion, the main reason you would want to play it. Don't get me wrong, it's not a masterpiece on the level of The Godfather or whatnot, but it is a genuinely enjoyable story, and I think the perfect example of how interactivity can enhance an otherwise generically good tale. Final Fantasy IV is one of the earliest examples I would point to as video game storytelling being not just a secondary feature of the medium, but a genuine artistic endeavor. And as such, unless you're a fluent speaker of Japanese, playing the original version on the SNES is arguably the worst way to experience this game. Now, there are some fan translations that attempt to rectify these issues. Most notably, the Naming Way edition comes highly recommended from Final Fantasy fans. But unfortunately, for some reason, when I tried to get this working, it just kept causing my Nintendo PC to crash. So instead, I opted to do 2 playthroughs of Final Fantasy IV side by side for this video. One of them I played on the officially released English FF2 for the SNES, and the other one I played in the Pixel Remaster, which does have a few mechanical changes as compared to the original, but from my understanding is still pretty faithful to the Japanese FF4. My goal with these 2 playthroughs was to be able to get the perspective of a 90s kid on the SNES, while also experiencing Square's first attempt at grand storytelling that would form the foundation of the franchise going forward. And because I've spent so much time emphasizing the importance of FF4's story, I think I'm gonna do something a little bit different for this video than I did for the previous 3. Instead of talking about the game as a whole in broad strokes, I want to go through the campaign of Final Fantasy IV and talk about the different mechanical choices as they are introduced, since so many of them tie into story elements and it would feel disingenuous to talk about them outside of that context. This style is definitely a bit of an experiment for me, so please comment below what you think of it or how you think it could be improved for future entries, since I suspect Final Fantasy will continue to have an emphasis on grander and grander tales as the franchise matures. And a blanket spoiler warning, as this video will contain spoilers for Final Fantasy IV, as well as the first 3 Final Fantasies and a few other games, movies, and shows, the list of which will be in the description, so proceed with caution. But for now, let's dive in with an absolutely iconic opening cinematic. Final Fantasy IV opens with a fleet of airships known as the Red Wings coming back from a successful mission to acquire the Water Crystal. Some of these Red Wings question whether their mission was necessary, but their leader, Cecil, shuts down these concerns by saying they're only following the orders of the king, and the king's orders are absolute. We then get a flashback revealing that this group acquired the Water Crystal not by delving through a dungeon and fighting monsters, but instead via slaughtering innocent mages in the peaceful kingdom of Mysidia. It's pretty clear that this introduction serves as the preview for an antagonist that our heroes will eventually end up fighting and defeating. Or at least it would be in a simpler story. Because as it turns out, Cecil, the guy we just saw lead a murder expedition, is our protagonist. And this is, at least in part, a story about his path to redemption. You see, while he puts a brave face onto his men, Cecil is conflicted about following the king's orders. And we see this as soon as we arrive in his home kingdom of Barron. After handing the water crystal over to his liege, Cecil hesitates and decides to ask why they needed to steal it from Mysidia. And though this is a relatively innocuous question from an otherwise loyal servant, it's a bridge too far for the king, and Cecil is immediately stripped of his position as commander of the Red Wings. Additionally, we're given our next task, to deliver a package to the Village of Mist. A pretty demeaning assignment befitting our new position, or lack thereof. The king then dismisses us from his chamber, and the player gains control of Cecil for the first time, allowing us to explore Castle Barron and meet characters who will become important later in the story. But before talking about all of them, I want to loop back to the cutscene we just watched. While it may not look impressive from a modern lens, Final Fantasy IV's approach to cinematics was a huge step forward at the time. And in this opening cutscene, we get to see the two major ways in which FF4 makes the story feel more dynamic. The first is by including scripted combat sequences. As on the return flight home, Cecil and the Red Wings are attacked by some monsters, and there's a couple of combats that we have no control over where Cecil wastes attack items on generic mobs. The second is by communicating emotions not just in character dialogue, but also in the way their models move. In the scene where Cecil asks the king why they needed to steal the water crystal, he initially goes to leave without saying anything. But after hesitating for a moment, he turns around and asks the question that ultimately gets him fired. This sort of thing is pretty standard now, and it's not even terribly uncommon for SNES games, but speaking as someone who's just come off the NES trilogy, this is a welcome upgrade. But okay, let's move on to meeting our cast of characters. First up is Kain, another soldier serving Barron and Cecil's childhood best friend. He's going to accompany Cecil on the delivery mission, and he's hoping that if we're successful, Cecil will get back in the king's favor and might get his title as commander of the Red Wings restored. Contrasting him is Barron, the captain of the guard. He seems to have it out for Cecil. In fact, he's the one who told the king that Cecil was acting disloyal, and as a result, he's probably in part responsible for the stripping of Cecil's title. The next character we meet is Barron's head engineer, Cid. For those who are unaware, Cid is kind of like Final Fantasy's equivalent to Anna. A version of Cid shows up in almost every Final Fantasy game, but they're all pretty different from each other. So far, every version of Cid I've run into has been an airship engineer, but it's possible this changes in future entries. This universe's Cid is definitely a friend of Cecil though, and he's downright outraged at the events that transpired in the introduction. Although, unfortunately, for the time being, there's not much he can do about it. The last character we run into is Rosa, Cecil's girlfriend. Although, since this is a game that came out in the early 90s, calling Rosa a character is a bit of an exaggeration. She feels much closer to a plot device than anything. And that's kind of absurd because she is the second most prominent female character in the story. Still, upon settling down with his girlfriend, Cecil goes over how distraught he is at the day's events. although he's not as bothered by losing his position as he is the horrors that he witnessed and enacted in Mysidia. Still, despite this, Cecil finds himself incapable of refusing the king's orders. He knows what they're doing is wrong and curses his own cowardice, but at the end of the day, he goes along with it because that's the path of least resistance. It's surprisingly deep stuff for a children's game, and we haven't even gotten to the first dungeon yet. But okay, fine, let's dive into the first segment of gameplay. As expected, you only have 2 party members, Cecil the Dark Knight and Kain the Dragoon, and they both work as fairly straightforward melee combatants, each of whom only has 1 command in addition to the basic attack and items. Cecil has access to Darkness, which costs 1/8 of his max HP, but launches a standard attack that hits all enemies at once, and as such is very good for clearing out mobs, especially if they are weak foes like goblins and bombs. Kain, on the other hand, has access to Jump, which is the first command with a charge time, and I suspect was given to you early to help players get to grip with how the ATB system works. When Kain uses Jump, he will leap into the air, and for a period of time, no one can interact with him. That means he can't be attacked by enemies, but it also means you can't heal him with potions or spells. Once Jump's charge time is complete, Kain will plummet back down to Earth, dealing double a standard attack damage to a single foe. This is similar to how Jump worked in Final Fantasy III, but I actually like it better under the ATB system because now there's an element of timing to avoiding foes' attacks while simultaneously allowing Kain to receive healing and buffs from your allies. Pretty cool stuff, even if at the end of the day it's not terribly complex. In order to reach the Village of Mist, this dynamic duo needs to pass through the Mist Cave, which serves as our tutorial dungeon. And this is as good a time as any to say that the dungeons in FF4 are an improvement over the NES trilogy, although not by a huge amount. From a mechanical perspective, they're still ultimately just mazes, although with one exception, they're not egregious in this regard. The main area of improvement, however, is in their atmosphere, which I recognize is a weird thing to praise for a SNES game, but they do genuinely feel like fleshed out environments. Many of the dungeons have elements of verticality, allowing you to go over or under different layers. Most of the longer dungeons also feature safe zones, and in these safe zones you can not only heal up using tents or cottages, but you can also save the game, which is especially helpful since most of these save zones come shortly before boss encounters. This does eliminate the endurance test that early FF dungeons often turned into, but as a trade-off, bosses are able to be more difficult without causing immense frustration from long runbacks. Although, I'll be honest, a lot of Final Fantasy IV's bosses are gimmick fights, and the tutorial boss, Mist Dragon, sets this tone appropriately. Its attacks are pretty weak, and it's arguably less threatening than some groups of generic enemies were. But as the fight moves on, it switches forms between being a dragon and being a wall of mist. And if you attack it when it is a mist wall, then it takes 0 damage and counterattacks you with a damaging ice spell. Because you're operating on the ATB system, the intended strategy is just to wait around. Eventually, it'll transform back into a dragon, and then you can unleash your attacks. If I'm being honest, it is an incredibly boring gimmick. Sure, it's the sort of fight that can only exist under ATB, but it's a bad fight, so I don't really see that as a selling point for the system. Moreover, I think it serves as a pretty poor tutorial, since it gives the player the message that sometimes you want to wait instead of taking your turn immediately, but throughout the rest of the game, this is almost never the case. There are a few niche interactions where you might want to intentionally wait on a character's turn, but 99% of the time, waiting is detrimental. You want to input your commands as quickly as possible. So yeah, in my opinion, Mist Dragon kinda sucks. But it does, at the very least, lead into an extremely cool story set piece. Upon exiting the cave and entering the village of Mist proper, the package Cecil was going to deliver explodes and releases a bunch of bomb monsters, making him into a Courier 6 archetype. You see, unbeknownst to Cecil, the village of Mist is populated by summoners, and the King of Barron thought that these powerful casters would be a threat to his global empire, so he decided to preemptively take them out. This fate mirrors what the evil empire did to the Dragoons in Final Fantasy II. So just in case you weren't convinced about being on the wrong side of this conflict, you're literally doing villain shit. There is one survivor of the initial explosion, a 7-year-old girl named Rydia, and she is crying because her mother just died. At first, I assumed her mom was just another victim of the bomb, but as it turns out, Cecil and Kain had a more direct hand in her mother's death. Remember that Mist Dragon we just finished fighting a minute ago? That was Rydia's mother's summon. And as it turns out, when you kill a summoned monster, the summoner dies as well. Their life force is linked. So, while Cecil's culpability in blowing up the town is questionable since he didn't know he was delivering a bomb, he did definitely directly kill Rydia's mother. And Kain is ready to take it a step further, suggesting that they kill Rydia to finalize the genocide. But this is finally a step too far for Cecil, and he intervenes saying that they need to protect Rydia, not kill her. The king's orders be damned. Kain reluctantly agrees to this, and then says they need to go back and rescue Rosa, as well as allying with other nations, so they can be powerful enough to take on Barron. Rydia, unsurprisingly, isn't exactly okay with this plan. She doesn't want to go anywhere with the men who just murdered her mother and threatened to kill her. And in her panic, she uses the Titan summon, which causes a massive earthquake, throwing the three of them out of Mist Village. Cecil wakes up in a clearing next to an unconscious Rydia, but Kain is nowhere to be found. Determined to protect her, Cecil carries Rydia to the nearby oasis town of Kaipo. But this isn't the safe haven he was hoping for. In the middle of the night, he's confronted by Barron soldiers who order him to hand over Rydia so that they can kill her. And when Cecil refuses, they attack him. After Cecil fights off these soldiers, Rydia finally decides to accept his protection, and she officially joins the party as one of your playable characters. But before talking about her role in the gameplay, I want to acknowledge the events we just saw play out are incredibly dark, especially for a children's game released in the early 90s. I don't think many game devs would have the courage to put the hero in a position of unwittingly participating in a genocide, much less have the sole survivor be one of the other protagonists. It's ripe ground for exploring a pretty interesting dynamic between the two main characters. Although, unfortunately, I'm not sure FF4 necessarily capitalizes on this. This is ultimately a story about Cecil's path to redemption, and protecting Rydia is his first step towards that goal, so it still accomplishes something, but I can't help but feel disappointed that there's not really any tension between Cecil and Rydia despite the circumstances of their meeting. Aside from that first night in the inn, Rydia doesn't even acknowledge that her traveling companion is the source of her most major trauma. Don't get me wrong, I understand why she's traveling with the party, Whether she forgives Cecil or not, he is very clearly her only hope for survival as a 7-year-old stranded in the wilderness. And over the course of the game's events, he protects her enough that I do genuinely believe they end up caring for each other. But it still feels like 1 or 2 additional conversations would have gone a long way towards improving both of their major arcs. But apparently Final Fantasy IV's story has a lot of cut content, so maybe this was initially the plan before things got scaled back. But that's enough of that. Let's talk about Rydia's role as a caster. For the first time in the Final Fantasy series, you don't purchase spells from shops. Instead, certain characters will just learn spells based on leveling up. And in Rydia's case, despite being named a summoner, she actually learns white, black, and summon magic. Although the only summon she gets initially is Chocobo, which is a single target high damage spell. There's also a few summons that drop as rare loot from enemies such as Bomb and Goblin, but I don't think these are particularly noteworthy. For the most part, they're much weaker than what Rydia has access to naturally. Because despite her age, she is an incredibly potent spellcaster, and in fact will be your primary mage for the first arc of the campaign. But as you might expect from a 7-year-old girl, she's also incredibly frail, and doesn't do much damage with physical attacks, so you're going to want to keep her in the back row. Because yeah, Final Fantasy IV brings back the row system. Although, with 1 or 2 exceptions, most characters almost exclusively want to be in the front or back row, so it feels pretty superfluous. There's also a bunch of weirdness around it. You can only ever have 3 people in one row and 2 in the other, and they need to be staggered in positions from each other. Additionally, if you are in the center position of the party, you get an accuracy bonus, and this can actually overcome the accuracy penalties given by being in the back row, so it's technically optimal to put a mage with a melee weapon in the back row in position 3, but this is really only relevant if you want to bonk things with Tellah's staff for like 4 damage. Otherwise, just remember that while rows technically still exist, they're basically kinda pointless. But moving on with the story, Cecil and Rydia are not the only important characters in Caipio. Rosa is here as well. She came looking for Cecil after she heard the mission went poorly, but she has fallen ill with desert fever, and the only hope of curing her is to retrieve a sand pearl from the Antlion den. So the party heads out for the Kingdom of Damcyan, where Antlions live. And along the way, they run into the sage Tellah, who is headed in the same direction for his own reasons. You see, his daughter Anna has run away from home, tricked by some fuckboy bard that wants to take advantage of her. So, as a dutiful father, Tellah intends to take her back home where she can grow up safe and chaste. Now, this is obviously a fucked up view for a father to have of his daughter, but with Rosa's life on the line, Cecil doesn't really have time to get involved in family drama. And since Tellah's going the same places, y'all, we might as well join forces. So we let the old man into the party. And he, like Rydia, is a caster. He's a sage, meaning he gets access to white and black magic. Although, as an old man, Tellah is our first primary example of gameplay story integration, as much of his toolkit revolves around the fact that he's getting too old for this adventurous life and definitely pushing himself farther than he should. For starters, Tellah's strength and vigor actually go down as he levels up, presumably because his physical body gets weaker as he ages. This isn't a huge deal. As a spellcaster, he's not punching people anyway, but it's a cute little Easter egg. However, the sands of time have taken a toll on Tellah's mind in addition to his body. And as such, despite being an incredibly experienced sage, Tellah has forgotten most of his spells. He has tier 1 and 2 spells, but that's about it, and he won't learn any new ones via level up. although he can attempt to remember them by casting his recall command, which gives him a low chance to cast a random spell, potentially one of the higher level ones he doesn't normally have access to. More often than not, recall will fail, but it is an interesting strategy, and I'm sure someone's done a silly little challenge run of recall only. The last gameplay gimmick that Tellah has is related to his mana pool, which starts out at 90 and never goes up. I imagine this is also supposed to be related to his age, as the poor guy doesn't have much room to grow. But it causes him to fit into a sort of Jagan role, as initially 90 is a decent amount of mana for the early game. And with access to tier 2 spells, he's going to be outclassing Rydia in a lot of respects. But as the campaign goes forward, Tellah is going to have to monopolize the party's ether supply just to contribute to basic fights. And in boss battles, forget about it, he's dead weight. And to an extent, that's even true with the first boss he faces, the OctoMa'am, which is one of the rare bosses in FF4 that doesn't have a gimmick to it. It's just a giant HP sponge that attacks physically, and that's about it. I handled her by spamming the Chocobo and Thunder spells, and it was no big deal. Although, despite her mechanics being unimpressive, the presentation is top-notch. The more you damage OctoMa'am, the more tentacles she loses. So not only do you get a visual indicator of progression in the fight, but you also feel like Cecil is down there chopping off this monster's limbs. It's cool stuff. But okay, after kicking squid ass, we arrive at the other side in Damcyan, only to see the Red Wings airbomb it into oblivion. The party rushes into the ruined castle and finds that almost everyone is dead. And their killing wasn't even the primary goal of this invasion. Our second genocide in as many hours was just a side effect in Barron's theft of the fire crystal. And, predictably, this attack also resulted in the death of Anna. But there is one survivor amongst the piles of corpses. And upon seeing him, Tellah is launched into a blind rage and begins beating the shit out of the spoony bard, blaming him for Anna's death, and in fact accusing the bard of attacking Anna himself. Despite the bard's protests, Tellah will not listen to reason. That is, until Anna speaks up, because she's not quite dead yet. And in her dying words, she explains to Tellah that he's wrong. She wasn't tricked by this bard, but truly loved him. And the two of them only eloped to Damcyan because they planned to get married and knew Tellah wouldn't approve. When the Red Wings attacked, Anna shielded the bard with her body and is the reason he survived. Not only that, but this bard, whose name is Edward by the way, is not just a random wanderer, but secretly the Prince of Damcyan. In her dying breath, Anna begs Edward and Tellah not to be mad at each other because she loves them both. And then she's gone. This scene is actually pretty interesting to me. It's obviously annoying that Anna is another female character defined entirely through her relationships with men, and it's definitely annoying to have her fridged purely for the development of Tellah and Edward, but I do at least appreciate the message that Tellah's overbearing parenting is what leads to the death of his daughter. The only reason that Edward and Anna were even in Damcyan was Tellah didn't consider Anna enough of a person to trust her in making her own decisions when it comes to romance. So they had to elope and ended up in harm's way. As a result, I don't think it would be entirely unfair to say that Tellah is the one to blame for his daughter's demise. Although he certainly doesn't see it this way. Tellah is furious and he's looking for a target of his anger. Initially, his ire went to Edward, but out of respect for Anna's dying words, that's not an option anymore. So instead, he has to turn to the next best target, a man named Golbez, who is the newly appointed leader of the Red Wings, replacing Cecil. Immediately upon learning Golbez's name, Tellah swears to kill him in revenge and storms off. And that leaves Edward, Rydia, and Cecil alone in the ruins of Edward's kingdom. And then, while Edward is grieving his recently deceased wife alongside all of his people, Rydia calls him a coward. She says she's also the survivor of a genocide and she's not crying, so he shouldn't either because he's an adult and she's a kid. And I don't know. I get that Rydia is a 7-year-old and so she doesn't have particularly good social skills, but this just feels unrealistic. Especially considering that both in the scenes prior to this and in one we'll get afterwards, Rydia is shown to be deeply affected and traumatized by the death of her people. I don't think it's impossible that she would lash out at Edward like this. Trauma doesn't make you a good person after all, but it feels very jarring and not what I would expect from the otherwise kindly child. Cecil is also a massive dick to Edward for what it's worth, telling him to man up and help them find the Desert Pearl, but this feels a lot more in character and understandable. Cecil is still kind of an asshole. He's only just begun his journey to redemption, so it can't be expected that overnight he would suddenly become a paragon of virtue. Moreover, his primary concern is still healing Rosa, and with his girlfriend's life on the line, I don't necessarily think Cecil would be too considerate of strangers' feelings. But the fact that both protagonists berate him so quickly, in conjunction with a couple of later scenes, send a bit of an uncomfortable message about Edward's need to man up immediately after watching his girlfriend die. God forbid the dude has a moment to grieve. Still, the campaign must move forward, and we did just lose Tellah, so we need a new party member. It's Edward's time to shine. Or rather flounder. You see, I'm fairly certain that Edward was intentionally designed to be an incredibly weak party member. His weapon type, harps, are incredibly low power, although in fairness, they do each have a secondary effect with a chance to inflict status, either sleep or charm. But if we're being honest, you're not using Edward to spam 12 damage attacks from the back row. As a bard, his main purpose is to make use of his 3 unique utility commands. The first one, Sing, sees Edward attempting to inflict a random status on every enemy. There's a 1 in 4 chance that the status chosen is Sleep, Confuse, Silence, or Nothing. However, the ability actually has a more than 25% failure rate because once the status is chosen, there's also an accuracy check on each enemy. And for the most part, the songs appear to be pretty inaccurate, especially against more dangerous foes. It's also worth noting that Silence is effectively another do-nothing status against any physical enemy, and at the time Edward joins, most of the enemies are physical. As such, this ability is incredibly unreliable, and even when it does go off, it's often pretty low impact. Edward's second ability is Salve, which allows him to consume a potion and split its healing effects amongst all active party members. In theory, I could see this being useful, but in practice, the healing provided is so minor that I'd almost rather just have Edward use a potion on whichever character needed healing the most. But Edward's last ability is what convinces me that he was intentionally designed to be of little to no use in combat, and that is the Hide command. If Edward chooses to hide, he removes himself from the battlefield, and he doesn't get attacked by enemies, but also cannot take any further actions until he unhides. You can't even use this tactically to set up a heal for Edward, because allies are also incapable of interacting with him while he's hiding. Additionally, as a passive ability, whenever Edward's HP is knocked into critical range, he will automatically go into hiding. And that's because, at this point in the story, Edward is kind of a coward. Or, put more charitably, Edward lacks the exceptional bravery that your other party members display. After all, I also wouldn't be enthusiastic about fighting giant turtles in death caves. But despite lacking in battle acumen, Edward shows himself to be useful immediately. He is knowledgeable about wildlife and therefore knows where the Antlion cave is, and not only that, he has a hovercraft that the party can use to travel there. So without any further ado, let's dive into our third dungeon and fight our third boss, the Antlion. The Antlion's gimmick is that it is mostly a passive boss, but anytime you hit it with a physical strike, it will counter with a very strong attack. Therefore, the primary strategy is simply to have Rydia spam spells in order to kill him without facing counters. You can speed things up a little by attacking with Cecil and Edward, but once your party's HP gets low, they kinda feel superfluous. Rydia's got this on her own. Chocobo's to the rescue once again. The Antlion is neither the first nor last time we'll encounter this mechanic. A lot of basic enemies like porcupines also counter physical strikes, and as we move forward in the campaign, there will be a variety of enemies featuring their own unique counters. This is an interesting idea in theory, as it can encourage you to change up your strategy, but in practice it comes off as kind of clunky. Because enemy ATB gauges are hidden from the player, it can be difficult to tell when the hit you sustained is thanks to a counter, or because the enemy just happened to attack you at that point in the battle. Moreover, I think this game's combat system is just a bit too simplistic for the counter system to really work. Because you can't change your party layout, when facing foes that counter magical or physical strikes, you don't get the option of trying something different. You just don't get to use those specific party members. The most egregious instance of this is in the game's final boss, who makes one of your 5 party members basically a glorified high potion dispenser, but discussion of the game's finale is a ways away. For now, just bear in mind that the counter mechanic is basically a mainstay from this point forward, and I never really find it satisfying. But with the Antlion slain and the Desert Pearl in hand, we can head on back to Kaipo and heal up Rosa. Upon waking up, Rosa informs the party that Golbez and the Red Wings are going to attack Fabul soon to steal their wind crystal. The group therefore resolves to head to Fabul in hopes of preventing another massacre. Rosa joins our ranks as well, and as a white mage, she functions as the party's primary healer. She has access to a good deal more support spells than Rydia, but lacks any offensive prowess. At least when it comes to her spellcasting, because Rosa is actually somewhat physically adept. I haven't mentioned it till now, but mages have the ability to wield bows in this game, giving them a decent attack from the back row. However, these attacks require arrows as consumable ammunition, so in most situations, it's just better to use spells instead of bows. But in Rosa's case, since she won't have any attacking spells until very late in the campaign, if she wants to deal damage, it's going to be with a bow and arrow. And she's actually a pretty decent archer, especially when you factor in elemental arrows taking advantage of enemy weaknesses. To supplement this strategy, Rosa has access to the aim command. And by aiming, Rosa can take an extended charge time in order to launch an arrow for double damage. And this is useful both in terms of saving ammunition and in maximizing the damage and defense formula to your advantage. As against high defense enemies, the aim charge time is usually going to more than double your offensive output. This means even in the Pixel Remaster, where arrows are no longer consumable and now have infinite durability, aim is still pretty useful for outputting big damage with what otherwise would be a utility unit. Unfortunately, Rosa's other special skill, Pray, is a lot less useful. By praying, Rosa can potentially restore a small amount of HP to the entire party for free, but it is significantly worse than group casting basic curative magic in almost every way. Prayer has a decently long charge time, which in my experience is typically longer than Rosa's casting time. It heals a pretty negligible amount of HP, and has a decent chance for her prayers to just go unanswered. At which point, thanks to the charge time, Rosa has basically wasted 2 actions worth of time to get no result. But even in the best case scenario, healing 200 to 300 across every party member just isn't worth it. I guess if you've run out of mana, it can be helpful in a pinch, but Rosa has such a deep MP pool that I never found myself running low until the final dungeon of the game, at which point I had a decent number of ethers and elixirs, so it was a non-concern. Okay, we're almost ready to go to Fabul. There's just one more scene we need to get through. Late at night, while everyone is resting up for the journey ahead, Edward sneaks out to the lake and mourns Anna some more. However, he is suddenly attacked by a lake hag. While fighting for his life, Edward gets a vision of Anna's ghost, and Anna encourages him to believe in himself and be strong for his people and his friends. With this encouragement, Edward resolves to be braver and stronger and is able to overcome the lake hag on his own. Interestingly, Edward doesn't get any mechanical upgrades from this scene to reflect his newfound strength and bravery. And at first, this seems like it might be a bit of gameplay story dissonance, but I actually think it works very well for Edward as a character. Because Edward is not a trained fighter. He's not practiced in magic. He honestly has no business being on the battlefield. And given his behavior up until now in the story, I would expect him to part ways with the party now that he's helped them get the Desert Pearl. But this isn't the case. Edward continues to travel with the group despite them foraying further and further into danger, and he's even willing to fight on the front lines during the invasion of Fabul. And I think that's Edward's strength and courage. His willingness to continue to fight for what's right, despite the very real risks it runs for someone as untrained and unprepared as him. Edward's character arc isn't quite over yet. There's a few more important scenes to it, but a running theme throughout will be the fact that Edward's power comes not from physical prowess, but from the strength of his resolve and his courage in continuing to put himself in dangerous situations. He still has a tendency to hide when his life is in absolute mortal peril, but the fact he's even willing to participate in the adventure is a huge act of bravery in and of itself. But speaking of that adventure, let's head off on the next step. To get to Fabul, we need to cross a mountain range. But there's a problem. A big wall of ice stands in the way of our only possible path. And this brings us to one of the cooler moments of gameplay story integration. Because Rosa requests that Rydia cast a fire spell to melt the wall of ice, and Rydia says she can't do it. And this is reflected in the battle system. Despite being a powerful black mage, Rydia can never learn any of the fire spells. Instead, she's stuck on the Blizzard and Thunder family. And since an early portion of the game had Rydia and Tellah in the party together, this discrepancy stands out since he would have access to both Fire and Fyra, showing that the Fire family does exist, it's just not something Rydia knows. Of course, if you've been paying attention to the story, you might suspect what the reason for this is. Rydia actually does know how to cast fire magic, she just doesn't want to because she was traumatized when her village got burned down. She even says she hates fire and she never wants to cast any fire spells. At this point, Rosa encourages her, saying that they need to get through the ice wall and Rydia is the only one who can help them. If she's not willing to cast a fire spell, then more people will suffer in the way that her friends and family did. And this is enough to motivate the 7-year-old child to, despite her trauma, cast a fire spell. Not only does this melt the ice wall and give you access to the mountains, but it adds the Fire family to Rydia's repertoire. I think this is a really cool moment. Pretty undeniably one of the better instances of gameplay story integration in FF4. I really like what it does for Rydia's characterization. But this is also the last time the Massacre of Mist will be mentioned in the game story, and effectively it's the end of Rydia's character arc around this trauma, which feels both too quick and too simple for my tastes. Stuff like Edward's cowardice or Tellah's aging body remain constant features of the battle system throughout their time in our party, and as a result feel a lot more impactful than Rydia missing the Fire family for a couple of dungeons. I get that for a SNES game, dwelling on the extended trauma recovery of this little girl is probably asking a bit much, especially since, as previously noted, FF4 had a significant amount of the script cut before the final draft. But I still find it a little bit unsatisfying that after this one event, Rydia is as proficient in fire magic as she is both Thunder and Blizzard. I understand that from a gameplay perspective, this is so we can hit the skeletons on Mount Hobbs for effective damage, since they're basically the first enemies we've faced to have a fire weakness, but I still would have appreciated a little something more. Maybe make her fire spells weaker than the other families, or have them more expensive to reflect her reluctance to cast this school of magic, at least until the next Rydia-centric event, which would feel like the appropriate time to fully remove any fire-related penalties. But I recognize that it's pretty easy to Monday morning quarterback, especially 35 years in the future, so it's worth acknowledging that this is still a phenomenal and groundbreaking scene, even if it's not a perfect one. It's yet another example to add into the docket of how games can truly provide unique experiences as an artistic medium. Mount Hobbs isn't a particularly complex dungeon, but the enemies spawning here represent a step up in terms of difficulty as compared to the early game. There's cockatrices who will petrify your characters, potentially completely removing them from combat. Spirits and skeletons who have high resistance to physical attacks and therefore must be handled by your mages. And most scarily, bombs, who, if not dealt with quickly, will explode to kill themselves and deal massive damage to your characters. Thankfully, Rosa's toolkit as a white mage is pretty well suited to counter each and every one of these threats. And this is largely true of every dungeon in Final Fantasy IV. Since the game knows exactly what your party layout is going to be, it tends to tailor the threats you'll face based upon the party members you have access to. This makes for a relatively smooth difficulty curve and for the most part stops any character from feeling worthless or overpowered unless the story demands it. It's pretty cool. Speaking of cool stuff though, upon reaching the summit of Mount Hobbs, we run into a bald man beating the shit out of monsters with his bare hands. This is Yang, the resident black belt of Final Fantasy IV. Despite the fact that monks are traditionally a very straightforward job, Yang has quite a bit more going on than his ancestors. He can equip a variety of claws which give his punches elemental affinities, thusly allowing him to exploit enemy weaknesses with his basic attack. Additionally, Yang has access to a kick, which is kind of like the equivalent of an AoE spell, since it deals very little damage compared to his standard attack, but hits all foes on screen, and thus can be useful for clearing mooks of goblins. Yang also has the Brace command, which allows him to spend a turn increasing his defense instead of attacking. Normally this isn't super useful since a dead enemy deals 0 damage to you anyway, but during prolonged boss fights it can be nice, especially if you suspect that Yang is going to be the target of a lot of attacks. Lastly, Yang's focus ability works nearly identically to Rosa's aim. It allows him to charge up an attack for an extended period of time before unleashing it at double power. Unlike Rosa, Yang doesn't have ammunition to worry about, but the doubled attack power is still nice, both for helping against high defense enemies or against foes with counters, since you would only have to face 1 counter for a charge attack instead of 2 for attacking twice. All in all, Yang is quite handy in a fight, and the game demonstrates this perfectly with his introduction, since he participates in a couple of scripted battles against monsters where he uses his wide variety of moves to defeat them soundly. But after fighting his way through 2 waves of monsters, a significantly scarier one shows up, and so the party swoops in to help with the boss fight against Mom Bomb. The Mom Bomb fight is pretty straightforward, and she basically plays like a bigger version of the standard bomb enemies you've been fighting throughout the entirety of Mount Hobbs. Upon dealing enough damage to her, she will explode and spawn 6 smaller minions. 3 of them are the tier 1 bombs and 3 of them are the tier 2 gray bombs, but each of these must be focused down quickly because they will self-destruct for massive damage to your party if left alone. Anyway, after defeating Mom Bomb, Yang informs the party that he's the only survivor amongst the Fabul monks, as they were attacked not too long ago. Everyone concludes that the monsters were sent by Golbez to intentionally weaken Fabul in preparation for his invasion. Since the only people left in the castle are trainees rather than veteran monks, Yang sees that he clearly needs the party's help, so the 5 of them rush to Fabul. Initially, the King of Fabul is wary of Cecil and doesn't want his assistance since he knows the Dark Knight was responsible for the massacre at Mysidia. However, Yang vouches for his newfound friend, and reluctantly, the king decides he's going to accept the alliance, if for no other reason than they desperately need whatever help they can get. However, he warns Cecil that sooner or later he's going to have to give up the Dark Knight mantle, since you cannot use darkness to defeat darkness. Then, suddenly, the castle is attacked, and everyone needs to assume their battle positions. The girls go into the back to assist with healing, and the boys take to the front lines because they're big manly men who need to fight. It's easy to roll your eyes at this very 90s misogyny moment, but I want to take a more positive spin by celebrating that Edward, despite his frailty, is continuing to be brave enough to go to the front lines. From a purely gameplay perspective, this is also one of the coolest segments in the story, as you get launched into battle after battle against soldiers and monsters, and you really feel like you're fighting for your life while losing ground in the cutscenes in between. And in that lovely gameplay story consonance, the absence of Rosa and Rydia means your party doesn't have access to reliable healing outside of Edward's pathetic salve skill. So, as Cecil and Yang's HP values continue to drop over time, you can feel the desperation that the devs are going for in that moment. This all culminates with the party backed into a corner in the Crystal Room, desperately trying to hold ground so that it doesn't get stolen. But then, the leader of the attacking forces reveals himself, and it's none other than Kain, Cecil's old friend. he has defected back to Barron and is now fighting alongside the Red Wings in order to steal the remainder of the crystals. Now, this betrayal was shocking to the party, but to the player, it's kind of expected. In fact, it was a fairly heavily signposted twist. Kain was initially much more willing to follow King Barron's cruel orders than Cecil was, and he mysteriously disappeared immediately after Cecil defected from the army. Moreover, Cecil and Kain are childhood friends. In fact, in a lot of ways, they are like brothers. And biblical scholars might have an inkling that a brother named Kain isn't exactly the most loyal guy in the world. But I think there's actually more to the biblical connection than just the simple concept of betrayal. You see, in the story of Cain and Abel, the reason Cain murders his brother comes down to pure and simple jealousy. Both Cain and Abel make offerings to God, with Cain providing fruit, whereas Abel provides meat. And God rejected Cain's offering and accepted Abel's. At various points throughout Final Fantasy IV's story, it's implied that Cain has feelings for Rosa. Yet these feelings are not reciprocated, and so Cain is jealous of his best friend for winning her affections when he couldn't. In other words, Final Fantasy IV says God is a woman, wokeness wins. In all seriousness, it's important to remember Cain's jealousy of Cecil. And I think it's reasonable to assume that this extends beyond Rosa. Cecil is the leader of the Red Wings, which seems like a position of higher authority than Cain as a simple dragoon, and Cecil appears to be more popular than Cain, easily making friends with Cid and inspiring loyalty in his men, whereas Cain is a much more isolated individual. Regardless of the specifics, what's important to note is that Cain is jealous of Cecil, despite legitimately still caring about him as a friend and pseudo-brother. But today, jealousy wins out, because Cain kicks Cecil's ass, knocking him on the ground just in time for Golbez to make his first appearance in the story. He is immediately imposing. He comes with his own villain theme and effortlessly swats away Yang and Edward, leaving the crystal defenseless. I also think Golbez's armor design looks like a natural upgrade or promotion from Dark Knight, and this subtly implies his superiority over Cecil, especially when taken in combination with the fact he functionally usurped him in command of the Red Wings. With the party on their last legs, Rydia and Rosa come down in an attempt to help, but this only results in Rosa herself being kidnapped and whisked away alongside the crystal. It's a pretty devastating defeat for our heroes, and Yang, Cecil, and Edward begin to wallow in their misery when Rydia snaps them out of it, making sure to tell them they don't have time to mourn. We gotta rescue Rosa. And the group agrees. Although, unfortunately, as she's been taken by the Red Wings, they don't have too many options without an airship. Cecil proposes that they sneak into Barron under the hopes that he can still trust Cid, since it's likely the old man can fix them up an airship to go challenge the Red Wings head on. And so, the King of Fabul lends them a boat, and once again emphasizes to Cecil that he cannot defeat evil by wielding the power of darkness. A message that is kind of undercut by the fact he also gives Cecil a dark blade, the Deathbringer, which I guess he just happened to have lying around the house for some reason. I don't know, don't worry about it. We're off to sail the seven seas. This journey doesn't exactly go smoothly, however. Before reaching our intended destination, we're attacked by Leviathan, Lord of the Seven Seas. Amidst the attack, Rydia falls overboard, so Yang dives in to try and save her, and then Edward falls over as well. Before Cecil can respond and try to save his companions, Leviathan launches one final strike and the ship goes down. And Cecil washes up on an unknown shore entirely alone. Distraught, he wanders into the nearest settlement and... uh-oh, that's not good. Mysidia is probably the last place Cecil wants to be right now. Remember, at the beginning of the game, he led an attack on this settlement and killed a bunch of civilians. And even though he's on the path to redemption, the population has far from forgiven him. Most of the civilians will curse you out or tell you that you deserve to die for what you did, and a couple of them will outright attack you. This guy turns you into a toad, and this dancer transforms you into a pig. I think this comes at the perfect point in the story for a couple of reasons. First, this is easily the lowest point in the story. Up until now, we failed to protect multiple crystals, Cecil's girlfriend got kidnapped, and all the rest of his companions have been strewn about in the seas Lord knows where. As such, it makes sense to continue the tragedy by having Cecil wash up in a relatively hostile location. But the fact it's Mysidia specifically fits because that makes the hostility Cecil's fault. And that's the other reason that timing-wise, I think the visit to Mysidia works best here. We are now about 5 hours into the campaign, and for most of it, Cecil and co have been behaving quite similar to a standard JRPG party. You know, delving through dungeons, collecting treasures, fighting an evil empire, standard good guy stuff. As such, for many players, Cecil's role in Mysidia's massacre has likely drifted into the background. By being thrust into Mysidia against our will, both the player and Cecil are forced to confront the very real consequences of the murders he did. Still, even while haunted by ghosts of the past, the path forward is clear for Cecil. He needs to reach Barron and get an airship, both to rescue Rosa and to search for his friends. And luckily, Mysidia actually has a pretty convenient path back to Cecil's homeland, the Devil's Road. This is a two-way teleportation device that leads between Barron and Mysidia. Although, unfortunately, it has been completely closed down and locked up by the Mysidians. Because after Cecil's last visit, they are justifiably afraid of more attacks from Barron. Cecil goes to Mysidia's elder to explain that he is now fighting against Barron and request access to the Devil's Road, but his request is denied. The elder is, again, understandably, skeptical of Cecil's devotion to redemption. He points out that as long as Cecil bears the mantle of the Dark Knight, he will never truly overcome the hatred in his soul. And so, if he really wants to fight for the forces of good, he should prove it by climbing Mount Ordeals and claiming the title of Paladin. Cecil agrees, despite the danger this task poses. So the Elder decides to send a couple of companions with him for help. The twins Porum and Palom. These guys are awesome. They serve as a bit of comic relief in an otherwise downer portion of the game, but also manage to come off as fully fleshed characters rather than being one-note joke machines. Palom is incredibly full of himself, bragging to anyone who will listen, and let's be honest, anyone who won't as well, about how he's a prodigy and will be the best dark mage in all the world sometime soon. He also doesn't really stand on ceremony, a fact that is immediately shown off in his introduction since he's late to the sage's summons. Throughout the campaign, whenever Palom meets someone new, he will be incredibly blunt and oftentimes rude to them, often earning a scolding or thrashing from his twin sister Porum, because she is very much concerned with being polite. She's the teacher's pet. And because of this, Porum finds herself apologizing for her twin brother's antics pretty frequently. Despite the similar naming scheme, the two of them honestly feel like they couldn't be more different. Where Palom is rude, impulsive, and absent-minded, Porum is detail-oriented, polite to strangers, and follows instructions to a T. And this dichotomy extends into areas other than their personality as well. The twins being different genders obviously isn't a coincidence, but they also have inverse color schemes from each other. And from a gameplay perspective, they're trying to accomplish basically opposite things. As a black mage, Palom launches powerful attacks against all of his foes, and his special ability Boast allows him to raise his own offenses, further supplementing the damage roll. Meanwhile, as a white mage, Porum uses a variety of healing and utility skills. Her special ability Cry also assists allies by unnerving enemies and making it easier to steal from them. Although, unfortunately, due to the game's structure, this is literally worthless because she will never overlap with the game's thief, Edge. However, despite the differences in their toolkits and personalities, the twins are actually at their best when working together. And we can see this through gameplay with their powerful twin cast ability, wherein the twins can spend both of their turns to cast a spell together that is far more powerful than anything they would be able to do individually. This allows for the player to gain early access to extremely OP spells like Flare and Meteor, which are normally reserved for the very end of the game. And throughout the time the kids are in your party, a single twin cast will usually end any random encounter. And this is one of the reasons that despite being 5-year-olds, the twins are going to be our party's primary carry throughout the next portions of the campaign. Although, this leads the question. If the Elder of Mysidia is actually trying to help Cecil, then why is he sending 5-year-olds with him? The first thing that comes to mind is the Elder isn't actually trying to help Cecil, but instead sending Porum and Palom to spy on him. But I don't find this answer to be satisfying either, since Porum and Palom aren't particularly good at being spies. In fact, Palom gives away the game almost immediately. Instead, I think the answer is much darker than that. The Elder sends 5-year-olds to assist Cecil because that's basically all he has left to offer. Mysidia was massacred not too long ago, and so the majority of their competent black and white mages died defending the crystal. And of those few that remain, most of them bear a lot of resentment towards Cecil. Do you think the guy who turns our entire party into toads is going to be willing to help climb Mount Ordeals? Porum and Palom are basically the only ones the Elder can turn to. And despite their frequent childish outbursts, they do take the responsibility seriously. Although, as they are children, they probably need a bit of training before we can set off on our quest proper. And thankfully, this training arc gives me an excuse to talk about something I've kind of neglected in the last couple of Final Fantasy videos, Chocobo. Technically, these land birds originated in Final Fantasy II, but in the previous 2 games, they've been pretty underutilized. Final Fantasy IV places this lovable critter front and center by expanding the family enormously. You of course get the basic yellow chocobo, which can be used to traverse the map without facing random encounters, and the fat chocobo, which retains its role from FF3 as an item storage device. But new to the franchise are the white chocobo and black chocobo breeds. White chocobo restores your mana upon talking to it, and I'm convinced that it was explicitly added to help Porum and Palom, since they almost certainly lose all their MP before reaching Mount Ordeals otherwise. The black chocobo, on the other hand, is the first time chocobos have plot relevance, as its ability to fly and land in forests means that it's mandatory to progress the story at a later point. This game also introduces the concept of chocobo ranchers and chocobo breeders, and in general just shoves the cute and cuddly critters much more in the player's face. They've gone from being mostly an Easter egg to being a primary part of the world. It's pretty cool stuff, but we should probably get back to the main story. Before entering Mount Ordeals, we get a glimpse as to what Golbez is up to. He and Kain have Rosa held captive in some sort of computerized cybernetic world, and he's decided that he needs to deal with Cecil before Cecil can become powerful enough to pose a threat. With that in mind, he decides to dispatch the first of his Elemental Archfiends, Scarmiglione. If you can't tell through my horrible pronunciation, this is an Italian name. And in fact, all 4 of the Elemental Archfiends in this game have Italian names. In addition to Scarmiglione, there's Cognazzo, Barbarisha, and Rubicante. And these names aren't Italian for no reason. They're all drawn from Dante's Inferno, which is actually more than just a failed 2010 edgy video game. For anyone who didn't have the Divine Comedy in their high school curriculum, Inferno is about the poet Dante descending through the 9 circles of hell. Along the way, he sees various sinners and how they are being tortured by ironic punishment. The 4 elemental archfiends each take their names from demons in the 8th circle of hell. The 8th circle is reserved for various forms of fraudsters, and these 4 demons specifically are tasked with dealing with Barators, which are a group of corrupt politicians dipped in boiling tar to represent their sticky fingers. As cool as this is, the naming scheme doesn't seem to have any thematic relevance. There's no corrupt politicians in Final Fantasy IV, and while you could argue that some of the mind control shenanigans that happen later would amount to fraud and deception, it feels like a pretty big stretch. In reality, I think Square just wanted to have 4 demons from the Divine Comedy because it sounds cool to pull names from a classical source. And that's a shame, because there's a portion of the Divine Comedy that I would argue is relevant to the themes of FF4, and specifically Cecil's sins. And that is the 1st circle of hell, where, amongst other groups, the neutrals preside. The neutrals are specifically those who failed or refused to take action in times of crisis. And while Cecil was complicit in some of the acts of Barron, I think the primary motivator for his complicity was his inability to stand up to the king. As such, what he's trying to atone for is less his actions and more his inaction. Although, in fairness, the 1st circle of hell would be a lot harder to reference through the Archfiend's names, since we don't actually see any demons there, instead mostly encountering its residents, which make up of famous Greeks and Romans, especially the philosophers, who tell Dante's self-insert that he is every bit their equal. It's important to remember that at times, the Divine Comedy is basically the first known instance of a fanfiction.net work. With the strange naming convention put aside, the Elemental Archfiends basically act as a glorified reference to Final Fantasy I, where the Archfiends were the primary antagonists for 90% of the story. Here, they serve as Golbez's most trusted and powerful minions, and will each be major boss fights in our quest to defeat him. But in addition to new enemies, our group gains a new ally. Or rather an old ally, because we run across Tellah, who is also climbing Mount Ordeals to try to get new power. He wants the Meteor spell, the most powerful legendary spell of them all, as he thinks its power will be necessary to defeat Golbez. Purim and Palom warn Tellah that Meteor has too great a cost, and he's likely to die if he tries casting it. Although they conveniently omit the fact that they've been twin casting Meteor to kill random goblins, and could probably fight Golbez in Tellah's stead, rendering his future sacrifice kind of meaningless. Still, with a 3rd mage in tow, the trek up Mount Ordeals should be relatively trivial. Although the enemy compositions are set up specifically to make Cecil feel completely worthless. Almost every foe you encounter is an undead of some kind, and as such, heavily resists the darkness element. Since the only weapons Cecil can equip are dark attuned, this means he's dealing little to no damage against any foes you run up against. Meanwhile, Palom can cast powerful fire spells, Purim can kill them with healing magic, and Tellah can do either. The twins also have the option to equip bows, and the newly acquired holy arrows deal exceptional damage to any undead foes. Thusly, this is yet another segment where the gameplay perfectly echoes the story's themes. You cannot, in fact, defeat evil with the power of darkness. And our journey caps off with a boss fight against Scarmaleone, who doubles down on these themes. Scarmaleone begins the fight with 6 skeleton minions, who, as we just discussed, are immune to all of Cecil's attacks. Scarmaleone himself isn't immune from dark damage, however he does counter physical attacks by casting a thunder spell. So Cecil still feels a bit like dead weight, since utilizing his standard strikes comes at a much higher cost than usual. Still, with the help of 3 powerful casters, this fight is a cinch. And so, after striking the Fiend of Earth down to the depths of hell, you proceed across the bridge and... surprise! He's back, bitch! Undead Scarmaleone reaches out from the underworld in order to ambush you. And this boss fight is a back attack, a mechanic that I haven't mentioned yet, but that has been present since the beginning of the game. Occasionally, enemies will ambush you as back attacks, and your rows get reversed, with the back row being in the front and the front row being in the back. In FF4, you can reverse the row order in a single action, so this isn't particularly detrimental, but it does cost one character's first turn, and occasionally can result in your mages taking more damage than expected, since they're suddenly on the front line. In Scarmaleone's case, however, it's mostly a flavor thing because Cecil is now completely fucking worthless, as Undead Scarmaleone is also immune to all of his standard attacks. So you can use Cecil's first turn putting everyone back in the correct positions. As for the fight itself, this time Scarmaleone focuses on applying status conditions, and silence in particular can be quite deadly as you're relying on mages for the majority of your damage. As long as you're stocked up with a decent number of curative items, it's not too bad, but it's definitely the most complex boss fights have been thus far. And the second stage, being an ambush, serves to appropriately heighten the stakes against the first of the Elemental Archfiends. That being said, I can't help but be a little bit confused about Scarmaleone's role in the overall narrative. He's supposed to be the Earth Elemental Archfiend, but he really comes off more as a Lord of Death than a Lord of Earth. In fairness, this isn't the first time that the undead have been associated with Earth in Final Fantasy, but at least from my own research, I can't find any connection between the concepts of Earth Elementals and the concepts of death in Japanese or any East Asian mythology. So unless I'm missing something, Scarmaleone doesn't really have a link to his title of Earth Archfiend. But even if he did, I'm a bit confused as to why the Masters of the Elements are working for Golbez to begin with. The best justification I can come up with is it has to do something with the elemental crystals, but even that doesn't fully make sense. At this point in the story, Golbez has collected the water, wind, and fire crystals, but the earth one is still outside of his grasp. As such, if he were really commanding these fiends through the power of the crystals, then why is he able to send the earth fiend after us when that's the only crystal he doesn't have yet? And that's before getting into the weirdness around the elemental crystals in this game, because their role in the story also doesn't entirely make sense. But I think that discussion is probably best saved for the point in the story where we've collected all 4 of them. So for now, let's move on to the conclusion of Cecil's redemption arc. When Cecil reaches the summit of Mount Ordeals, a voice calls down to him from the heavens. It says, "My son, long have I awaited you, and much sorrow have I endured. I shall now entrust you with my strength. In doing so, my pain will only grow, but there is no other way." Then a glowing sword descends from on high, and when Cecil catches it, there is a huge flash of light, and when the light clears, he is no longer in his Dark Knight outfit, instead donning the traditional paladin robes. The disembodied voice continues to speak, instructing Cecil, "Break from your past and overcome the darkness. Only then will you receive the holy power." You must defeat the Dark Knight within you. And at this, Cecil's reflection comes out of the mirror, and it is still in Dark Knight armor. Suddenly, a solo 1v1 battle between Cecil and his inner Dark Knight ensues. However, you cannot defeat the Dark Knight by attacking it, and instead must embrace the protective and curative path of the Paladin. The Dark Knight will continue to spam the Darkness skill, draining its own health in the process. And so, in order to outlast the Darkness, rather than resorting to violence, you must use the Defend command and the Cure spell to heal yourself and reduce damage. Once again, the gameplay and story are just lining up in a phenomenal way. It really is what this game excels at. And upon defeating the inner Dark Knight, the voice from on high will congratulate Cecil. You have done well. Now my spirit will become light, and that light will be your strength. With it, you must stop Golbez. Farewell, my son. We then get several more flashes of light, and Cecil's reflection changes from that of a Dark Knight to that of a Paladin. And now, finally, after defeating our inner Dark Knight, we get the notification that Cecil has become a Paladin. The new class, of course, comes with some mechanical changes, and we'll get to them in a second, but first I want to dwell on the scene we've just described, because it is ultimately the conclusion of Cecil's character arc. He's gone from being a genocide-enabling Dark Knight to a Paladin, the ultimate protector of the innocent. And while stories of redemption are common throughout all sorts of cultures, it's pretty hard to deny that this one is steeped in a lot of Judeo-Christian imagery. A voice calling down from the heavens and addressing my son is the sort of thing that would be right at home on PureFlix. But Cecil becoming a Paladin as the ultimate redemption is also rooted in Christian ideology. For those unaware, the original 12 Paladins were a legendary order of knights meant to fight for Christianity and against Islam. My 8th grade English teacher would be so proud of me right now, y'all. Not only did I reference the Divine Comedy in this video, but now I'm digging into the Song of Roland. Gary Schmidt, if you're watching, this is all you, bro. Of course, even for atheist heathens like myself, there's an appeal to the redemption story. Characters like Zuko and Uncle Iroh are amongst my favorites in all of media. And in contrast to a more simplistic tale like Star Wars, wherein the fascists of Darth Vader and Kylo Ren only earn their redemption in death, the fact that Cecil fulfills his journey to the light side only partway through the narrative means he doesn't get the easy way out of an early grave. He has to continue to put in the work to right his past wrongs, and live with the guilt of knowing that some things cannot be fixed. And that's why I particularly like how the citizens of Mysidia respond to Cecil when he returns as a fully fledged paladin. Some of them accept this as proof of his redemption, but others don't think he's gone far enough. In fact, for the families of those he mercilessly slaughtered, there's nothing he can do to earn their forgiveness. And I think this is a really nice and realistic touch. Because, yeah, Cecil has done some stuff that he can never fully make up for. But that doesn't make him a lost cause or irredeemable. He does very much earn his redemption. And throughout the remainder of FF4's campaign, Cecil is an explicit force for good. But his good and evil actions don't counter each other out like some sort of hackneyed 2000s karma system. Cecil saves a lot of lives and prevents a lot of suffering, but Cecil also takes a lot of lives and causes a lot of suffering. He's a complicated character for a genuinely mature story. But Cecil's new Paladin drip isn't just for looks, he gets a gameplay revamp to go along with the conclusion of his character arc. So let's take a look at how Cecil plays as a Paladin. The least impressive addition to his toolkit is the low-level white magic. Cecil's never gonna learn a spell more advanced than Cura, so in most situations, it's better for him just to swing his sword. But his restorative magic can be useful on the battlefield to patch people up without using items, and it's a nice backup option if a battle ends up taking a desperate turn, especially since he can cure status with Isuna. Much more interesting and thematically relevant is Cecil's cover skill. With cover, he can choose one of his allies to protect with his life, automatically blocking any single target attacks headed their way and absorbing it into his HP instead. Additionally, as a passive effect, Cecil will automatically guard any ally in critical HP, which is indicated by their health total turning red. It is worth noting, however, that if Cecil himself is in critical HP, he will not guard anyone, whether it's through the passive ability or the activated one. I'll be honest, I didn't find active cover to be super useful in my playthrough, although in large part this is because having Cecil take a turn off swinging his sword gives you a significantly lower damage output, since the main appeal of the Paladin class is it can wield much stronger weapons and armor as compared to the Dark Knight. And in particular, all of its swords are imbued with the holy element. So while the undead were initially immune from Cecil's attacks, now they take effective damage from him. And as such, on the journey back down Mount Ordeals, you feel like Cecil has had a massive power spike, despite not actually getting statistically stronger. His ordeal is over. He's turned away from the path of darkness and embraced the man he was always supposed to be. Although, on that topic, Cecil isn't the only one who finds what he's looking for atop Mount Ordeals. As you may recall, Tellah decided to climb this mountain with us in hopes of getting the Meteor spell, which he plans to use to kill Golbez and avenge Anna. And right after Cecil becomes a paladin, Tellah learns the Meteor spell, and additionally remembers all of the other spells he had forgotten along the way. This event means he loses access to the recall command, but he gains all of his forgotten spells, and that means he now has access to almost every black and white spell in the game. As such, he is a very flexible powerhouse, firing off powerful magical attacks and assisting the team with high-level utility. However, despite this upgrade, Tellah's MP does not change. He is still stuck at a max of 90. And so, while accessing these high-level spells is undeniably an upgrade, it feels like a downgrade. In future encounters, you kind of have to use the more expensive spells for Tellah to contribute in any meaningful way. But by utilizing them, you dig into his minuscule mana pool, and as such, Tellah becomes useless much faster than when he was just firing off level 1 fire and level 2 Fyra. You can, of course, try to manage this downside with the Asper spell or by chugging ethers like your life depends on it, but at the end of the day, it's still a significant downside and a constant reminder that Tellah is pushing himself much farther than he should. These expensive spells just take more of a toll on his body than they did when he was a young man. And on that topic, the 90 MP cap also means that while Meteor is added to Tellah's spell pool, he's incapable of casting it in battle, because Meteor has an MP cost of 99. This means Porum and Palom were right. Tellah cannot cast that spell without endangering his own life. But Tellah seems almost ignorant to this, single-mindedly focused on his vengeance for his dead daughter. I honestly think it's pretty thematically fitting that at the point Cecil finally gives up the hatred and darkness that's been haunting his heart, Tellah fully embraces the darkness that will ultimately lead to his demise. But I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. Before we can get to the tragic conclusion of Tellah's arc, we need to return to Mysidia. Upon reporting back to the Elder of Mysidia, he reveals that Porum and Palom weren't just sent to help Cecil, but were in fact spying on him so that the Mysidians could ascertain whether or not he was legitimate in his want for redemption. Because the twins have reported positively on Cecil, the Elder agrees to open the Devil's Road. But Purim and Palom request to continue to accompany the newly redeemed Paladin. The Elder is initially taken aback, as this goes far outside the scope of their duty. But Purim and Palom insist. They've been inspired by Cecil's bravery and want to see his mission through to the end. As residents of Mysidia, they've seen the horrors of war firsthand and want to do whatever they can to prevent the suffering of others. It's a pretty nice character moment and helps the twins feel like more than just comic relief characters. But with that out of the way, we take the Devil's Road and return to Barron for the first time since this game's prologue. And the mood here is quite different than when we left. There's an air of anxiety hovering throughout the entire city. Ambient dialogue reveals that Cid has been locked up in the dungeon, and civilians are worried that they might be next. This is exactly the sort of energy you expect from a place living under an unpredictable authoritarian. There is one bright spot in this gloomy atmosphere, and that is we're reunited with our old friend Yang. But something's not quite right about him. He's somehow become the captain of the City Watch, and he immediately orders his men to attack the traitor Cecil. After we reluctantly give him a good thrashing, Yang snaps out of his funk and reveals that he had been mind-controlled by Golbez. You see, Golbez has the power of hypnosis on his side, and as such, he's secretly been the mastermind this whole time, controlling the King of Barron in order to do his bidding. As such, if we can get into the fortress, we might be able to break the spell over the king and rescue Cid from prison all in one fell swoop. Unfortunately, this is not the only bit of exposition Yang has for us. With a heavy heart, the mustached monk reports to Cecil that Rydia is dead. He watched firsthand as Leviathan swallowed her whole. This is a huge gut punch. It's obviously tragic when any party member dies, and even more so with it being a 7-year-old girl, but this represents more than just an individual's death. Rydia was the last living summoner, so with her death, so too dies a people. Not only does this mean summon magic is lost to the world forever, but other aspects of their culture are gone for good. And since the genocide of Mist was in part Cecil's doing, however unintentionally, he bears some amount of responsibility for this. Pretty dark for a kid's game, huh? There is at least one silver lining to this whole situation, because Yang's hypnosis had an unexpected upside. As captain of the town watch, he has keys to every building in the city, so we can sneak in through the waterway in order to enter the castle undetected. The sewers are exactly what you expect from a JRPG dungeon about going in the sewer, but upon exiting them and entering the castle, we run into Bagan. Remember him, the little bitch from the prologue? Well, as it turns out, he's also aware of Golbez hypnotizing people, and has decided that his loyalty is to Barron, not to Golbez. Therefore, he wants to help us in breaking the spell. So we put aside our differences, he joins our party, and... wait a minute. We already have 5 characters in our party though. Cecil, Purim, Palom, Tellah, and Yang. And there's only 5 slots on the team. Yeah, something's not adding up, and Purim and Palom smell a rat. Here, Palom's lack of decorum comes in handy, as he just calls the asshole for what he is. A bad liar and an even worse actor. And so, with his deception revealed, Bagan has no choice but to fight us head on. So he transforms into a monster, and we enter a pretty obnoxious boss fight. Bagan has 3 health bars, one for his main body and one for each of his arms. The arms themselves are quite fragile, so you can kill them in order to reduce Bagan's firepower. But if both arms are ever dead at the same time, Bagan will immediately regenerate them, leading to wasted effort on your part. Instead, the optimal strategy is to kill one arm and then focus on Bagan while taking damage from the other one. And this is pretty unfortunate because the arms apply a new status condition, Sap. Sap is similar to poison, except for instead of proccing on your turn, it causes your health to steadily tick down over the ATB system. And for whatever reason, even if you have the settings on wait mode, your health will still tick down while in item and spell menus. So that's just another way that wait mode feels like a bizarre half measure. But believe it or not, Drain is not the most obnoxious status condition the arms can apply, because they also have the ability to paralyze a character, which not only negates their ability to act, but also freezes the AT beat bar, so even once you heal them, they're lagging behind in the turn count. And Bagan likes to cast Reflect on himself, which is especially obnoxious since your current team composition has 3 out of 5 characters in the Spellcaster role. Although there is a cheeky little workaround you can use with Tellah's newfound knowledge. If you cast Reflect on one of your own party members and then target them with the offensive spells, the spell will be reflected back at the enemy team and therefore bypasses Bagan's Reflect. This is an inconsistent strategy though, since any reflected spell hits a random target, and with the arms in play, you can't guarantee that they will hit Bagan instead of just decimating his arms, which, as I previously stated, doesn't really help in making progress. All things considered, this makes for a pretty stressful fight, but it's still absolutely manageable, and upon completion, you can lay to rest one of the most obnoxious characters in this tale. But now it's time to confront the king. And as it turns out, he's not the king at all. Instead, it is the Archfiend of Water, Kanatsu. This turtle fiend is a relatively straightforward fight. He summons tidal waves to attack your whole team and hides inside his shell to recover HP, but both of these actions can be disrupted with a well-timed thunder spell. As such, the only real challenge is ensuring that you time your castings properly, which can be a bit tricky under the ATB system since the various thunder spells take additional time to charge up. Other than that, there's nothing to report. This is a very straightforward gimmick fight, although I think it overstays its welcome a bit thanks to the turtle's massive health pool. But once you prove that Pikachu beats Blastoise, Cid shows up. It turns out he broke himself out of jail and didn't need our help at all. Cecil explains the situation, and Cid reveals that he actually has an airship that he kept hidden from Barron called the Enterprise. The group heads out to retrieve it, but then disaster strikes. From beyond death, Kanatsu springs a trap and locks the party in a super small room with walls slowly closing in. Since both doors are locked without any hope of breaking them down, it looks like everyone's about to become a Jill sandwich. And that's when Purim and Palom give each other a knowing look. They've decided, without the need to exchange words, they know exactly what they're going to do. After bidding farewell to Cecil, the twins simultaneously cast the petrification spell, targeting themselves. And, tragically, right before our eyes, these two promising youths turn into lifeless statues. I'm not gonna lie, this scene got to me. The killing of comic relief characters is always such a shocking way to raise the stakes. But this noble sacrifice also didn't come out of nowhere. This is entirely in character for Purim and Palom, especially after the second scene in Mysidia, where they decide to go with Cecil despite the enormous risk to their lives. Technically they aren't dead, simply magically petrified, and we actually have the means to reverse this process, but as Tellah attempts to cast the Asuna skill, we are given the notification that it doesn't work. Because Purim and Palom willingly turned themselves into statues, normal magical means will not reverse the process. And one clever little detail I like is you can try using a golden needle on the statues, but similarly, it doesn't work. The fact that the game lets you interact with them keeps that glimmer of hope in the back of your mind, and anytime I was presented with a new key item, I desperately hoped that it was what would free these twins from their stone prison, but alas, none of them worked. Instead, our only option is to proceed forward. We need to make their sacrifice worth it. So the group boards the Enterprise with a new party member in tow. That's right, Cid's not just here as window dressing, he is fully fledged and playable, which means it only took Final Fantasy 4 entries before we got a playable Cid, as compared to Fire Emblem's 13 before playable Anna. Although, rather than Awakening, I think Three Houses would probably be a better comparison point, because this version of Cid is probably the weakest non-Edward party member. He's basically only capable of physical combat, but he does at least have the flexibility of equipping hammers for the front row or bows for the back row. Personally, I kept him in the back because he can't really equip heavy armor, so he's pretty squishy. And at the very least, elemental arrows allowed Cid to exploit weaknesses. Speaking of which, his only real gimmick is the scan ability, which reveals an enemy's weaknesses. This is nice, I guess, but it's also just the peak spell which white mages gain access to, so Cid feels like a worse version of a white mage. Additionally, hilariously, scan does not work on bosses, and those are the primary enemies where I want to know their weaknesses, since boss fights tend to be very dragged out. Overall, Cid is just designed in a very weird way from a gameplay perspective. Unlike Edward, I can't see any reason why he would intentionally be weak, so I assume the devs just didn't really know what to do with the engineer class, and decided this was good enough, but in my opinion, it kind of isn't. Oh well, at least he has a sweet ride. Although, as soon as we board said sweet ride, we are confronted by the Red Wings. Thankfully, Kain isn't looking to fight. Instead, he presents the party with an ultimatum. Cecil needs to retrieve the Earth Crystal and deliver it to Golbez, or else they will kill Rosa. And unfortunately, with his girlfriend's life at stake, Cecil really doesn't have a choice, so he agrees to these demands, and our next objective is to retrieve the Earth Crystal. This is a pretty interesting plot beat that unfortunately really doesn't go anywhere. As we saw earlier in Damcyan, Cecil is willing to throw aside kindness for the sake of saving Rosa's life, so it makes sense that he'd be willing to accept this trade. But it's kind of baffling to me that none of his companions speak up against this. Cid I can buy, he also cares about Rosa and wants to protect her, but why are Yang and Tellah willing to work with the enemy for Cecil's sake? Tellah, in particular, has already shown his willingness to abandon the party out of his blind rage towards Golbez, so it really doesn't make any sense that he would be willing to put aside those principles to help this time around. But even if we accept that for gameplay reasons they couldn't give any of the characters an excuse to leave the party, there's not even any NPCs who comment on Cecil's decision to work with Golbez, even though it is under duress. And that just strikes me as really odd. Cecil is a character who is primarily defined by the fact that he was willing to work alongside the forces of evil in the beginning of the campaign and slowly overcame the darkness within him before reaching redemption as a paladin. Being asked to retrieve the Earth Crystal is the first major instance of Cecil being tempted to fall back on his old sins since climbing Mount Ordeals, and he immediately succumbs to that temptation. The fact that the game doesn't even debate the ethics of sacrificing Rosa's life to save the world feels like a real missed opportunity. But this plotline's shortcomings run even deeper than that. Because aside from the inherent evil that is giving the Earth Crystal to Golbez, Cecil doesn't actually have to do anything wrong during this segment of the campaign. Whereas the other three crystals were acquired via massacring innocents, the Earth Crystal has conveniently been stolen by a Dark Elf, which means Cecil only has to fight monsters. Therefore, there's no ethical dilemma to be had about killing innocents for the greater good. What's more, if you talk to the Earth Crystal's guardians, they give you explicit permission to borrow the crystal for as long as you need it. So like, Cecil isn't even stealing it secondhand. It honestly feels like this ultimatum doesn't serve any purpose from a story perspective. Instead, it purely exists to give you an extra town to visit and an extra dungeon to explore. And in a game that is otherwise very narratively sound and doesn't shy away from tackling difficult topics, is a little disappointing. But that's enough dwelling on missed opportunities. There's still plenty of cool character beats coming up, they just don't revolve around Cecil. At this point in the campaign, we have an airship, so technically you can explore almost anywhere in the overworld. And as such, there are some side quests that become available at this point. But for continuing the main story, our next destination is the Kingdom of Trioia. The Society of Trioia stands out from the rest of Final Fantasy IV. They have abandoned monarchy in favor of having a ruling council decide things. Although this council is entirely made up of women because the people of Trioia have decided women are better rulers than men, which is exactly the sort of eye-rolling faux progressivism I expect from a 90s game. Although, before you give FF4 any feminism awards, bear in mind you can pay 100,000 gil to visit a strip club. I assumed this gated progression similar to the ferry in FF1, but as it turns out the only thing you're paying for is the privilege of being able to sneak into the dressing room and get scolded by dancers. Final Fantasy IV certainly has interesting portrayals of women, doesn't it? The actual method of progress is to head into the castle, where our party runs across an old friend. Edward is here, although he has sustained major injuries from the shipwreck and is now bedridden while he tries to recover. Upon seeing Cecil, Edward immediately volunteers to rejoin the group and assist them in their current quest. But before Cecil can respond, Tellah interjects, telling Edward that he would only be a burden in his current condition. Sensing the obvious resentment, Edward apologizes to Tellah for getting Anna killed. But the old sage doesn't even acknowledge this with a response. His anger burns too deep. Cecil, Yang, and Cid then tell Edward that his health should be his primary concern and gallivanting with them is unlikely to aid his recovery. So, with a heavy heart, Edward agrees to stay bedridden, but in hopes that he can assist them from afar, he gives Cecil the twin harp, which is a magical instrument that will always echo the notes played on Edward's own harp, therefore allowing him to basically play music via telephone. This is also where we learn that the Earth Crystal has been stolen by a Dark Elf. So we need to hop on a black chocobo to fly over to his lair, but there's a twist to this dungeon. Because Dark Elves are weak to metal, this lair has been outfitted with an extremely strong magnet, and the magnetism will paralyze anyone wielding any sort of metallic equipment. Swords, armor, shields, it doesn't matter, you can't use any of it. Tellah and Yang are largely unaffected, but Cecil and Cid lose access to the majority of their gear. Both of them can equip bows, although they're limited in which arrows they can equip because again, no metal. And Cid technically also has access to a wooden hammer, but defensively, both of them get screwed pretty hard, dropping down to leather armor as their most effective defensive tool. And for Cecil in particular, this really hurts because he leans hard on his holy swords and metal plate armor in order to stand out from the rest of the physical units. As such, the Dark Elf's lair has the potential to stand out as a pretty cool dungeon. And I felt severely underpowered here, more than I had at any other point in the campaign. Although this is also where the game introduces generic enemies with the SAP status in Vampire Bats and Draculades, so it gets docked a couple of points in my book for that. When the group reaches the bottom of the cave and confronts the Dark Elf, it's clear they are hopelessly outmatched. Without his holy sword, Cecil is basically dead weight, and Tellah and Yang don't have the combined might necessary to take down such a powerful foe. So the party gets their butt whooped and nearly wipes. But at this point, we cut back to Edward. He senses, as if supernaturally, that something is wrong, and he needs to get to his harp to play a song that will disable the effects of the magnets. The doctors warn him not to do it, that he's pushing his body, but Edward persists, tripping over himself during the very short journey across the room. And when he gets to his instrument, he starts to play the tune he learned in a distant land, and the twin harp responds in kind, dispelling the Dark Elf's magic and allowing Cecil to equip his holy sword. The party then licks their wounds and challenges the now significantly weaker elf to a second bout, and it is a total pushover. Probably the easiest boss fight in the game aside from the Mist Dragon. After an overwhelming victory, the gang returns to Edward's side and thank him. He saved their lives, and despite the fact that he's minimizing his accomplishments, none of them will. They insist that Edward's song was the only reason they were even capable of fighting the Dark Elf, and the gameplay reflects this, with him being such a pushover once Edward starts playing his tune. Edward continues to insist that his contributions weren't all that significant, and this is when Tellah finally speaks up. After giving Edward the silent treatment for their entire relationship, Tellah says that he now finally understands what Anna saw in Edward. During their battle with the Dark Elf, Edward showed true courage and integrity, and Tellah says that Anna was fortunate to have Edward's love. This is what finally gets Edward to acknowledge his own accomplishments. He says he now understands why Anna sacrificed her life to save him, and agrees to rest up and focus on his own healing. This is effectively the end of Edward's story, and this scene is what elevated him to be my favorite character in the game, so I do want to take a moment to go over everything he's done in the story and why I like him so very much. During the first half of the campaign, Edward's story maps pretty cleanly onto the idea that true courage isn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to continue despite your fear. It's a well-done arc, but nothing particularly groundbreaking, so it alone wouldn't have been enough to sell me on the character as my favorite. But after the shipwreck, Edward is effectively a disabled character. Nobody ever uses the word disabled, or even goes in depth as to the specifics of his injuries, but he was wounded enough that he can't get out of bed, has a doctor and nurse attending him 24/7, and is constantly exhausted despite sleeping the majority of the day. When told he can't join the party, Edward has a palpable and understandable frustration with his own physical frailty. But despite these limitations, Edward finds a way to contribute to the fight, and these contributions are not minimized by his friends. Edward himself tries to minimize them, presumably due to self-consciousness, but everyone around him, even Tellah, who bears resentment towards Edward, recognizes the contributions for the major help that they were. Part of why I like this so much is, as a disabled person, I can relate to basically every step of this storyline. Prior to a pretty extreme surgery, there was a point in my life where getting out of bed took hours on a daily basis. And during particularly bad flare-ups, that is occasionally still the case. My physical limitations have not only effectively killed hobbies like hiking and camping, but often prevent me from doing otherwise basic tasks like shoveling snow or mowing the lawn. And while I recognize on a broad scope that this is just a reality of my life, I find it difficult not to be hard on myself when doing things like canceling plans because of a flare-up or getting a wheelchair at a museum visit. And this is particularly hard because in the real world, not everyone is as kind about disability as Cecil and Tellah were. I live in the United States, and my government is currently openly flirting with eugenics. But even amongst those on the left, a political ideology that supposedly supports marginalized peoples, disabled folks are often seen as the lowest priority or just outright disposable. It's chilling just how casually people are willing to describe another human being as worthless or incapable of contributing anything simply because they can't accomplish traditionally simple tasks. And from a JRPG perspective, Edward is extremely incapable of accomplishing basic tasks. Despite the fact your party has an empty slot, he can't join you and explore in the dungeons. But Edward is still able to contribute, and his contributions are recognized not just by the other party members, but by the narrative itself. The Dark Knight goes from being an automatic defeat to an absolute cakewalk. And the only thing that changes is Edward plays a song that he knows is meant to ward away elves. I also really like that this contribution does not magically cure Edward's disability. He is, if anything, more exhausted the next time we see him from straining far more than he should have. It's just really great stuff, and I'd argue it's better disability rep than we get in most modern pieces of media. I could gush about Edward all day, but we should probably move on with the story. Rosa won't rescue herself after all. Now that we have the Earth Crystal, Golbez agrees to make the exchange in the Tower of Zot. Although the name is a bit of a misnomer. The Tower of Zot is less of a tower and more of a space station. This dungeon is a bit jarring. Up until now, things have been mostly within the fantasy genre, but the Tower of Zot is our first hint at the fact that FF4 will eventually become a science fiction story. Final Fantasy has always played things kind of fast and loose in incorporating some sci-fi elements. FF1 has a construct that could be read as a robot, give you the levitation stone that you can use to get an airship, and in fact, the very idea of airships, engineers, and carpet bombing leans more towards sci-fi than traditional fantasy, but this story commits very hard to the genre shift in a way that I honestly didn't expect for such an early entry. I knew coming into this franchise marathon that eventually Final Fantasy abandoned the fantasy genre, but I didn't expect it to happen during the golden age of the series. Instead, I thought it was one of those elements of modern Final Fantasy that hardcore fans detested. Don't get me wrong, I welcome the introduction of sci-fi elements, and I find the combination of advanced technology and fantasy magic make for a rather unique setting. But the shift itself is pretty jarring, and even though this location has showed up before in a cutscene, it still caught me off guard when we finally got to explore it, and I saw that, yes, it is just basically a space station. But despite the shift in setting, we haven't fully abandoned our fantasy roots, because the boss of this dungeon is a trio of witches known as the Magus Sisters. This is an incredibly weird gimmick boss. The sisters are named Mindy, Cindy, and Sandy, and they have a special move they refer to as the Delta attack. The way it works is Sandy casts Reflect on Cindy, then Mindy casts a magic spell at Cindy, which gets bounced off of her and hits someone in Cecil's party. This is a weirdly convoluted way of casting spells that target your party, and I'm not entirely certain what the purpose of it is. It gets around your own reflects, I guess, but I didn't really use Reflect all that often in my playthrough, and especially not when Tellah with 90 MP was my only caster. You can also interrupt the Delta attack fairly easily by casting Dispel on Cindy, so she just gets hit by Mindy's attacks, with no downside for you. The only genuinely challenging part of this encounter is the fact that Cindy has the full life spell, meaning that she can revive either of her sisters if you knock them out before her. But even though I was caught off guard by this, I was able to first try the boss without any real difficulty. Although, I'll say this, while the sisters didn't pose that much of a challenge, they certainly left an impression on me with their unique combat style. And part of me wonders if that's the point. The ability to use Reflect offensively instead of defensively makes FF4's magic system seem more complex and nuanced than it actually is. In reality, there really isn't a benefit to using Reflect offensively, but it does look damn cool. After defeating the sisters, Cecil heads for the top floor of the tower to meet up with Golbez. Here, he hands over the Earth Crystal, but Golbez reneges on the deal, and does not deliver Rosa. Tellah then decides to take this opportunity to attempt his revenge. We go into a fixed battle camera, and Tellah fires off spells against Golbez, but Golbez shrugs them off. Even Tellah's most powerful magic isn't capable of getting the job done. So he resolves it's finally time to cast Meteor. His friends cry out, knowing that Meteor will be the death of him, but Tellah doesn't care. Anything for his revenge. So he fires off the most powerful spell known to man. And it's still not enough. Golbez is shocked, but relatively unharmed. And Tellah collapses in exhaustion from the effort. He sacrificed everything, even his own life, in his mad pursuit for revenge, and in the end, he got nothing out of it. Well, technically not nothing. Meteor was at least strong enough that it seems to have broken the mind control spell Golbez had over Kain. And upon realizing this, Golbez decides it's time to go. But Cecil doesn't want to let him get away that easily. He goes to attack, but Golbez dodges and counters with a devastating lightning strike. Cecil is down and completely vulnerable. So Golbez goes for the finishing blow, but something makes him hesitate. Rather than killing Cecil, Golbez turns and leaves, declaring we'll finish this next time. The party concludes Meteor must have weakened Golbez enough that he couldn't risk prolonging the confrontation. But while Cecil's life was spared this day, Tellah isn't so lucky. He lay on the ground dying, and in his last breaths, he expresses regret. He has been lost this whole time, consumed by a single-minded hatred. And yet, even now, as he recognizes just how much hatred has consumed him, he's unable to let it go. Tellah's very last words are requesting that Cecil avenge Anna for him. He can't let this hate go even in death. And if it were up to Tellah, he would pass it on to another. Worse still, he wants to pass this mission of hatred onto Cecil, who has done so much to overcome his own inner darkness. It's so tragic. Tellah is honestly the perfect example of how good protagonists are not always good people. Throughout the entire story, we've seen the old man get consumed more and more by his character flaws. And even the brief virtuous moments, like his final conversation with Edward or his deathbed realization that he'd been consumed by hatred, are not enough to overcome the darkness in his heart. He's just a bit too far gone. I also really like that his journey parallels Cecil's, just in the opposite direction. He was never necessarily a good guy. His overbearing parentage is the reason that Anna died, but he wasn't always quite as bad as he was at the end of the road. While Cecil was able to put aside his hatred, in part thanks to the support of his loved ones, Tellah slips deeper and deeper into hatred's dark embrace because he ignores the warnings of those around him. I mentioned this earlier, but I also appreciate the irony of Tellah getting the meteor spell at the same time that Cecil becomes a paladin. It really emphasizes how the two of them are on opposite tracks. Because while Cecil is the main character of this story, I think the themes of forgiveness, redemption, and the inner darkness in otherwise good people apply to multiple party members, not just him. And Tellah is, unfortunately, the primary example of someone who is incapable of achieving his redemption. But while the old man might have failed, that doesn't mean we have no more party members looking to overcome the darkness in their hearts. Because, as you may recall, Meteor broke Golbez's hypnosis over Kain, and as such, the Dragoon rejoins our party and helps to rescue Rosa from last-minute execution. This scene is pretty interesting in fleshing out Kain's characterization, as he's been absent for the majority of the story. He apologizes for his actions, and while Cecil is quick to forgive him because he was brainwashed, Kain admits that even while serving Golbez, there was a small part of him that was conscious and just stood by. Moreover, he tells Rosa that that conscious part of him wanted to be near Rosa, which is why he stayed by her but didn't do anything else. I really like how these interactions go, because Kain could very easily have used hypnosis to handwave all of his behavior, and in fact, both Cecil and Rosa initially begin with that assumption, but Kain corrects them and takes accountability for his actions. We obviously don't have mind control in real life, but there are things that could parallel Kain's altered state, such as substance use or manic episodes. And in these situations, it can be tempting to let people off the hook for behavior that they weren't entirely in control of, but just as Cecil's fragment of awareness means that he needs to accept responsibility for his betrayal, so too do people in altered states have to accept that the actions taken while inebriated were still actions that they took. As we learn more about the specific mechanics of mind control in this setting, these parallels will become more and more relevant, but for the time being, Kain's shame and willingness to confront his own responsibility are nice details in this interaction. It's also interesting to note that during Cecil and Rosa's reunion, Kain looks noticeably uncomfortable when they embrace, as he seemingly still harbors feelings for Rosa and is jealous that she chose his friend instead of him. Overall, it looks like while Kain's more extreme actions can be attributed to the hypnosis, he certainly has his own issues he needs to work through, and by joining Cecil's party, he can at least attempt to atone for these sins. And his first opportunity comes very quickly because Kain is a key component of the upcoming boss fight against Barbarecia. The Elemental Archfiend of Wind is a boss fight designed specifically to highlight Rosa and Kain's talents since they are new to your squad. In addition to attacking with wind magic, she will inflict slow petrification, which Rosa can easily cure with Isuna. As for Kain, he is downright essential for this boss fight, as Barbarecia will frequently pull up a massive tornado that weakens all physical attacks and can only be countered via a jump. As such, this mostly plays out like a gimmick fight. Although, I'd argue it's not as bad as Garuda from FF3, which is that game's version of the Dragoon-only boss fight. Still, while it's an improvement, this fight isn't much better, and I'm happy to be done with it. But now the party runs into another problem. The Tower of Zod is going to self-destruct, and they need to get out of here ASAP. But luckily, Rosa knows a spell that lets her teleport into Cecil's bedroom. On the one hand, my inner feminist is annoyed that yet again Rosa is reduced to just her relationship with Cecil, but on the other hand, my inner 12-year-old finds it hilarious that Rosa's booty call spell is actually used within the story. Even though we've escaped from the immediate danger in the Tower of Zod, by surrendering the Earth Crystal, we've ensured that Golbez accomplished his goals. After all, he now has access to all 4 elemental crystals. But Kain reveals that it's not quite over yet. Golbez may have collected the 4 elemental crystals on the surface, but there are 4 dark crystals that stand as their counterparts, and they exist underground. And with that reveal, now is probably as good a time as any to talk about my biggest annoyance in Final Fantasy IV's story. And I recognize that this is an enormous nitpick, but the elemental crystals make absolutely no sense in this narrative. Traditionally, these 4 crystals were associated with the 4 elements: Earth, Fire, Water, and Wind. And in the other Final Fantasy games I've played, this association has been strong. In FF1, the Fire Crystal is inside of a volcano. In Final Fantasy III, you need to restore the Water Crystal in order to reverse a terrible flood that has engulfed the entire world. Even looking at the spin-off series Bravely Default, these crystals are closely tied to their elements. The Wind Crystal's corruption completely shuts down Ansheim's windmill, and the Earth Crystal makes tree roots completely engulf Wiswald. Meanwhile, in Final Fantasy IV, while the crystals are named after the 4 elements, that's it. They're not linked in any concrete way. It really feels like they were just given the names of Earth, Water, Wind, and Fire because Final Fantasies 1 and 3 also had the 4 elemental crystals. And I appreciate that the game is trying to call back to earlier entries, but we already had the 4 elemental archfiends, who are, for the most part, actually tied to their elements. I don't think it was really necessary for them to arbitrarily label these crystals with elements that have no relevance to the story. And that goes doubly so for the dark crystals, which feel like a complete ass-pull. The dark crystals first got introduced in Final Fantasy III, and they were a key part of that game's larger lore building. Because while our world had the 4 Warriors of Light unite and awaken the light crystals to fight back the darkness, a parallel opposite world called the World of Darkness had 4 Warriors of Darkness awaken the dark crystals to push back light. The idea was that too much light or too much darkness could both lead to an apocalyptic level event. And as such, there was a cycle of heroes trying to maintain balance by pushing back one force or the other whenever it became too dominant. It was a really cool idea that unfortunately didn't get expanded on all that much because it only became plot relevant in the final dungeon of the game and otherwise was relegated to occasional NPC dialogue. So when Kain dropped the idea of dark crystals, I was excited that we were going to explore this fertile ground. But as it turns out, the dark crystals are just more crystals, but they're underground instead of above ground. The whole reason that they exist is to give Golbez more things to look for after getting the 4 crystals on the surface. The fact that there are 4 dark crystals to correspond with the 4 light crystals isn't even relevant because Golbez gets 2 of them off screen, and the remaining 2 don't seem to be tied to any particular element. In truth, the reason Golbez is collecting these crystals isn't for any sort of mastery over the elements or the control of light and darkness, but because he needs the 8 crystals so that he can power up the Tower of Babil in order to reach the moon. I don't really mind the moon being his end goal, as there's some cool plot stuff that happens once we go full science fiction. But this plan just seems so far removed from the elemental crystals that Golbez might as well be collecting Infinity Stones or Dragon Balls. Like I said, this is ultimately just a nitpick. Them being named after the elemental crystals doesn't really subtract much from the story, but it doesn't add anything either, and it stands out as a really bizarre choice. But despite my misgivings, we do have to go after the dark crystals. And thankfully, Kain swiped a magma rock from Golbez. So we travel to the town of Agart, throw the magma rock down a well, and this causes a nearby dormant volcano to suddenly erupt and get rid of all of its magma, so then we can go down inside of it to reach the underground. I'm not sure I understand the physics behind any of that, but it's a fantasy game, whatever. It is worth noting that Agart also has an observatory, and you can take a look through the telescope to see this planet's twin moons. If you talk to the nearby scientist, he tells you that the smaller moon has been turning red recently for some reason. This is, of course, eventually going to be relevant to the story, as we're about to learn that Golbez's ultimate ambition is to reach the moon. But I do think it's kind of cool that this random NPC hints at lunar nonsense shortly before the main plot will. But after that brief aside, it's time to finally dive into the underground. We arrive to find that Golbez and his Red Wings have somehow gotten here before us, and are doing battle with the dwarves, who are launching cannonballs at them out of their tanks. Unfortunately, the Enterprise gets caught in the crossfire and ends up taking heavy damage from both the Red Wings and the Dwarven tanks. So we are forced to land and go inside the Dwarven castle. Talking to the NPCs here will reveal that the princess has lost her dollies. A point that is surprisingly actually tied to the main story, not some sort of side quest. Bearing this in mind, we go talk to the king, and he has revealed that, unfortunately, Golbez has already gotten 2 of the 4 dark crystals. But the king isn't too worried about the situation, as the other 2 are incredibly secure. One of them is locked in the sealed cave, which Golbez has no means of accessing, and the other one is hidden behind his throne room. However, when the king mentions this, Yang senses a disturbance. So while Cid goes to repair the Enterprise, the other 4 investigate the crystal's hiding place and find that the princess's dolls are back there, but they've been magically enchanted by Golbez to act as his spy masters or something. I'm not entirely clear how the mechanics of this work, but it pushes us into a boss fight. This is a really weird encounter that starts with 6 individual dolls who eventually combine into one giant dolly. I'm not sure if I was overleveled or if this fight is just easy, but from a gameplay perspective, it didn't make any impression on me. Although it did really nail the creepy vibe of a possessed children's toy and successfully threw me off in time for an encounter with Golbez. Because the dolls had telepathically communicated the crystal's location to him. So he's shown up to add it to his collection, and he'll kill anyone who stands in his way. Unlike our previous encounters, this one actually results in a boss fight against the antagonist. However, as his first action, Golbez summons a Shadow Dragon. And because I'm a Fire Emblem YouTuber, it deals immense damage to my entire party. With everyone but Cecil down for the count, Golbez prepares to go in for the finishing blow, but suddenly he's interrupted by a Mist Dragon? Out of nowhere, a mysterious girl clad in green shows up to save the day, and it's Rydia. She's back, but somehow an adult? And didn't Yang say she got eaten by the Leviathan? Oh well, those questions can wait, cause we're in the middle of battle. And with all other allies knocked down, we need to frantically scramble to revive them while simultaneously attacking Golbez to stop him from killing us. This makes for an incredibly frantic boss fight, and it really feels like you went from the edge of defeat to having a chance at victory. And as such, this stands out to me as yet another great example of FF4 marrying gameplay and story. But once the boss battle concludes, things get a little bit weird. Rydia explains that she wasn't actually eaten by Leviathan, but instead he took her to the Land of Summons, where he trained her to be a more powerful summoner. And this reflects in gameplay, as Rydia now has access to more powerful summons, including her mother's Mist Dragon, which, instead of dealing elemental damage, deals damage to all foes equal to Rydia's current HP. You can also choose to go on a few side quests to round out Rydia's summon catalog, but I never did that as she felt powerful enough even without them. Rydia's black magic talents have also increased, with her gaining the tier 2 versions of Fire, Thunder, and Blizzard. But unfortunately, she's no longer able to cast any white magic. And in-game, there's no explanation for this given. She just says she can't cast white magic anymore. Presumably, this was so that Rosa could still be useful as the team's dedicated healer, but I honestly think it would have been fine if Rydia still had access to her low-level white magic. Aside from the mechanical changes, Rydia has also obviously aged quite a bit, and she explains this by saying that time flows differently in the Land of Summons. And I don't know, this technically explains her rapidly aging from a 7-year-old girl to a fully fledged adult, but these sorts of things always make me uncomfortable. Similar to the Deep Realms from Fire Emblem Fates, I can't help but feel like the real reason Rydia was aged up was so that she could be an acceptable target of sexual desire. She's given fairly promiscuous clothing as an adult summoner, and while I don't mind sexualized character models in video games, it feels pretty uncomfortable for them to have put it on a character who we were first introduced to as a 7-year-old girl. And it's not just the players that the devs want to sexualize Rydia, because later in the story we'll meet a character whose whole gimmick is flirting with her despite the fact that she constantly expresses her disinterest in him. It's all just really uncomfortable. And as a side effect of this accelerated aging, Rydia has basically gone through the remainder of her character arc off-screen. Because the genocide of Mist and Rydia's trauma in general are just completely forgotten as far as the narrative is concerned. Cecil mentions to Kain that Rydia is the child they rescued from Mist, but other than that, the fact her entire family and everyone she ever knew were all killed right in front of her face just don't get mentioned. Effectively, she got over her trauma and learned how to be a much more powerful summoner, including getting access to her mother's summon, the Mist Dragon, all off camera. And much like Rosa, Rydia kind of becomes a non-character for the rest of the story, which is pretty disappointing because I think at the outset of this tale, Rydia had the potential to be the most interesting of Cecil's allies by far. But her characterization as a child was fairly inconsistent, and her characterization as an adult basically doesn't exist, so she ends up feeling pretty disappointing to me. The Ice Wall scene is still a nice example of gameplay story consonance, and when she rescues your party with her mother's Mist Dragon, it's pretty darn exciting, but zooming out, it kind of feels like hype moments in Aura. Which isn't always a bad thing. I think stories can benefit from hype moments in Aura, but if that's all a character is bringing to the narrative, then they start to feel pretty underwritten. And unfortunately, that's kind of how I feel about Rydia at the end of the day. From the polls I put out on my community tab, I know she's a very popular member of the cast, but I honestly felt like she just wasn't as fleshed out as she should have been. Sure, she's got more going on than Yang and Cid do, but when compared to characters like Edward, Tellah, Cecil, and Kain, she starts to feel a lot less interesting, and I can only bemoan her as a missed opportunity. And speaking of missed opportunities, Rydia's return doesn't really answer the question of why Leviathan attacked our boat oh so many hours ago. In my first playthrough, I assumed that Leviathan was just an uncontrollable force of nature, destroying ships presumably because we stole the water crystal. But the reveal that he brought Rydia to the Land of Summons in order to tutor her implies that there's more going on there than just an untamed animal. And in fact, if you go side questing, you can go to the Land of Summons and learn that Leviathan is its king. The Land of Summons doesn't appear to have any sort of conflict with Fabul, so why then did he attack a Fabul sailing vessel? It's a question the game seems entirely uninterested in, but it feels like a pretty massive plot hole. And it's the sort of thing that would be really easy to explain with just 1 or 2 additional lines of dialogue. Since Rydia is the last summoner alive, it would make sense that Leviathan wants to protect her and potentially train her up. And since she was traveling with Cecil, who at the time was still a Dark Knight, it's reasonable to assume that Leviathan might think he had kidnapped her. In fact, you could very well argue that at the beginning of the journey, Cecil does kidnap Rydia. So, it makes sense that Leviathan might want to forcibly extract her from this hostage situation, casualties be damned. But instead, we get absolutely no explanation. I guess Leviathan just likes fucking with trade vessels, lol. Although, funny enough, that isn't even the weirdest thing to happen in this throne room. Because while the gang is reminiscing with the newly adultified Rydia and failing to ask important questions about Leviathan, Golbez's hand self-revives and steals the crystal, then teleports away. What the fuck just happened? Is Golbez, immortal? Is he a ghost now? I genuinely don't know what's going on. This is a fantasy game, so I'm willing to suspend my disbelief for all sorts of crazy things, but I need to be told what crazy things I'm believing in, rather than just seeing a guy transform into a hand and teleport away. The next time we see Golbez, he's a fully formed human again, so does he have, regenerative properties? Can he just transform at will? And if so, where does he get these properties from? Because while later we will learn that he's not human, he's not the only member of his race we encounter, and none of them show the powers of immortality or hand transformation or whatever other magic tricks Golbez has up his sleeve. It seems pretty clear to me that the writers wanted Golbez to get away with the 7th crystal in order to increase the stakes of the story, but couldn't figure out a way for that to make any sort of logical sense and just abandoned the idea. But okay, whatever. Golbez got away, so the party informs the Dwarf King that they've lost the 7th crystal, and they say it's all their fault, but I gotta be honest, I think the King of the Dwarves has a bit of responsibility too. He's the one who revealed its location immediately as soon as we showed up, and he also clearly didn't stand in the way of Golbez entering the chamber, because there's only one door. Meanwhile, we, at the very least, put up some resistance to Golbez, almost fucking died defending the crystal, and then only lost it because he has a heretofore unmentioned ability to transform into a hand after he dies. But okay, sure, it's Cecil's fault we lost the crystal, you useless fucking dwarf. This is where we get the reveal that Golbez is taking the crystals to the Tower of Babil so he can reach the moon, and since we're apparently the only ones who fucking do anything around here, our party's gonna storm the Tower of Babil and try to recover them while the Dwarf King sits on his lazy ass. The Tower of Babil, much like the Tower of Zot before it, doesn't look so much like a fantasy setting and instead has the mechanical trappings you would expect in science fiction. In fact, the most prominent encounter in this location are robotic security eyes that summon monsters to fight you. And unlike the Tower of Zot, the boss you fight here also leans more in the science fiction direction, as instead of facing off against a trio of witches, you must defeat a mad scientist and his Frankenstein creation. This boss battle has 2 phases, and while I don't have much to say about the first phase, the second one is yet another instance of Final Fantasy IV telling a story through its gameplay, as the insane Dr. Luge will pepper your group with status ailments like poison and sleep, but after a certain number of turns, casts Esuna on your party to cure them of their ailments. To me, this reads less like someone attempting to genuinely fight you, and more like a scientist conducting experiments. It's pretty cool stuff, and it even makes for a somewhat unique and interesting boss fight, since up until now, status ailments haven't really been a major focus. In his dying breath, Dr. Luge tells us that our victory will be short-lived, because the tower's cannons are going to kill all of the dwarves. So we rush down to try and save them. But even after killing the cannon operators, unfortunately, we learn they've been put on auto-fire, and there's no way to unlock them. And what follows from this is a very strange scene. Yang decides that he's going to be the one to shut down the cannons, so he kicks everyone else out of the control room, locks the door behind him, and then fucking explodes? I'll be honest, I'm not entirely sure what's supposed to be going on in this cutscene, but I think there's two distinct possibilities. The first is that Yang decided to punch the computer so hard that it blew up in order to stop the cannons from auto-firing, and as a result, died himself in the explosion. The second, and weirder possibility, is that Yang spontaneously combusted in order to blow up the control room from the inside. And this might sound like a bit of a shitpost, but there is actually a little bit of precedent for this. You see, Yang is analogous to the Black Belt job, which in Final Fantasy III had the ability to invigorate and charge its body with energy. However, if a Black Belt invigorated 3 times in a row, they would self-destruct, causing damage to themselves. Yang's charge attack is clearly inspired by the Invigorate command, but transferred into the ATB system, and as such, it's reasonable to assume that he could always overcharge and blow himself up, and potentially cause collateral damage, as happens in Bravely Default. Either way, the conclusion is clear. Yang sacrificed himself to save the dwarves, and this is presented as the same sort of sad moment as Porum and Palom sacrificing themselves in order to save Cecil. And like, on the surface, yeah, it's sad, a guy died and he's one of our party members, but in the moment, I didn't really feel anything. Part of it is because I just didn't really care about Yang as a character. He has very little dialogue and even less personality, and while it can be shocking to lose a playable character, Final Fantasy IV kind of numbed me to that by constantly rotating out the entire non-Cecil squad. In fact, this isn't even the first time we've lost a party member due to their self-sacrifice. I just mentioned how this parallels Porum and Palom. But I think the biggest thing that stopped Yang's death from emotionally resonating with me is how confusing it was. I just presented what I believe to be the 2 most reasonable explanations of what happened, but neither of them occurred to me in the moment. They were both conclusions that I thought of while scripting this video out. When this cutscene first played out, I had no idea what had happened other than Yang dying and somehow the cannons getting stopped. As such, the intended dramatic effect just kind of fell flat for me. Cecil's troubles aren't over yet though, because at this point Golbez returns to the Tower of Babil and unleashes a trap, collapsing the drawbridge underneath the entire party's feet. As the team plummets towards the lava, it looks like it's over for them. But Cid swoops in at the last minute to catch them on the Enterprise. However, this moment of joy is short-lived, as the Red Wings are chasing down the Enterprise and somehow they are faster than our airship. So Cid decides that the only course of action remaining to them is a desperate ploy. He has Cecil drive the Enterprise through the crater and up to the surface world, and jumps overboard with a bomb, which he detonates to blow up and collapse the crater, therefore trapping the Red Wings underground, while Cecil and co are safely on the surface. With 2 self-sacrifices in the course of about 2 minutes, it's once again hard to feel the emotional impact of Cid's death. Cid definitely had a little bit more going on than Yang, but he's still not exactly what I would call a deep character. And much like with Yang before him, I'm not entirely clear about the mechanics of Cid's self-sacrifice. This time, at least, I don't have to speculate about the facts of what happened, but the reason is still baffling. If he has a bomb already, then why does Cid need to jump overboard? Couldn't he just throw the bomb over the side and collapse the cave that way? And for that matter, why are the Red Wings faster than us? The Enterprise is supposed to be this top secret airship that Cid hid from the king. And as far as I'm aware, Golbez doesn't have any sort of top-notch mechanic working on his airships. In fact, later in the story, we learn in pretty explicit terms that the Red Wing fleet is weaker than the Enterprise, since it's unable to travel over lava without getting an upgrade first. Having now had 5 party members die, with 4 of them being self-sacrifices, I get the feeling that FF4's story is trying to evoke a similar feeling to Final Fantasy II, where many of your allies died in the line of duty as you were the underdogs fighting against a giant world-spanning empire. But the deaths in Final Fantasy II, most of which were self-sacrifices, felt like they had a logical through line to them. Joseph held a boulder just long enough for the party to escape, and 20 hours later, Rickard does the same thing with the Demon Emperor. Minwu used all of his power to open a magical seal for the party. These deaths have a certain amount of logic to them, and not only that, but the story and world acknowledges their loss. The last cutscene of Final Fantasy II is the party reflecting on everyone that they've lost in order to achieve their victory. Meanwhile, Yang's sacrifice is almost immediately forgotten. He gave his life to protect the dwarves, and yet next time we're in Dwarf Castle, there's not even a mention of it. Although, I suspect the reason for that is depending on the order in which you do side content. By the time you return to King Groit, you might have realized that Yang is in fact not actually dead. And neither is Cid, for that matter. Despite the somewhat indulgent number of self-sacrifices that FF4 has, the only character with the good sense to stay dead is Tellah. Everyone else is magically alive or healed by the end of the game. In the case of Porum and Palom, I think this actually makes sense. They weren't ever literally dead, they were just permanently petrified, and them getting freed by the Elder of Mysidia, who is the most powerful mage we're aware of, makes a lot of sense. But in the case of Cid and Yang, their deaths were both nonsensical, but also pretty definitive. Both of them exploded. Like, how on earth does Cid survive the fall, let alone the explosion? Although, arguably, Cid is the more excusable fake-out death since he actually shows up and has a role in the story going forward. Meanwhile, Yang only exists for side content so you can find him getting nursed back to health and do the domestic abuse side quest. It is admittedly quite funny that the only way you can rouse him from his coma is to smack him with his wife's frying pan, which is apparently his morning wake-up routine, but I don't think this is a good enough joke to sacrifice the integrity of the main story. Whenever a narrative fakes a death, it runs the risk of making future deaths feel less dramatic and impactful, and even makes the specter of death feel like a non-threat since the characters have shown themselves to be otherwise immortal. And with how egregious Yang and Cid's fake-out deaths are, it very much felt that way for me. It also undercuts whatever impact their sacrifice was meant to have. I personally didn't connect with Yang or Cid enough to feel much when they died, but I imagine that people who liked them a lot as characters felt a gut punch when they sacrificed themselves. And that feeling is undercut by the unlikely survival of these exploding bros. I honestly think a much better approach would either be to have them remain dead to heighten the drama and stakes going into the endgame, or not have them fake their deaths at all. After all, the feeling of dread and constantly being defeated is accomplished pretty well in FF4's story without the countless fake-out deaths. Cecil is consistently losing crystals to Golbez, and at the point we're at in the story right now, he has lost 7 out of 8 of them. As such, the narrative has the same sort of downer underdog mood that Final Fantasy II did so well without needing to stack up a significant body count. But speaking of that downer tone, despite the sacrifices of Cid and Yang, Cecil and co. have still failed in their primary mission of recovering the 7 crystals from Golbez. and as such, we need to figure out what our next step is. Before Cid jumped off the side of our airship, he said that we should go check in with his boys, and upon doing that, they upgrade the Enterprise to give it a claw, which allows us to move around Edward's old hovercraft. This means we can get through the shallows in any part of the world, and as such, the entire overworld is opened up to us. There's a few side quests we can go on, such as getting extra summons for Rydia, but the main story progression involves traveling to the kingdom of Emblem. The castle is destroyed and abandoned after Golbez attacked, and if we travel through a nearby cave, we can find the survivors saying that their prince, Edge, has gone to try and fight Rubicante, the fourth of the Elemental Fiends. You see, Rubicante killed Edge's parents, so he has been consumed by a quest for revenge in a similar manner to Tellah. And indeed, when we finally run across Edge ourselves, he is initiating a duel with Rubicante. But unfortunately for Edge, the phrase "fight fire with fire" doesn't really work out for him. As it turns out, the Archfiend of Fire absorbs Edge's fire attacks. So, defeated and humiliated, this angry prince reluctantly decides to join the party. Despite his job name being Ninja, Edge functions much more like a generalist, and I would say he's most comparable to the classic Red Mage archetype. Edge has decent physical stats, although since he can't use the best armor, he will be noticeably more frail than Cecil and Kain, while still being bulkier than the mages. His offenses are also kind of behind the other physical fighters. He is capable of dual wielding, which is nice, but in my experience didn't help to close the damage gap. Instead, the main way that he can output big damage is with the throw command, taken straight from Ninja in FF3, wherein he throws a shuriken, katana, or sword and destroys it, but deals a ton of damage to the foe he targets. This means he's pretty effective as both a front or backliner, so long as you have the funds to continue to supply his throwing habits. Even if you're not throwing away physical weapons, Edge can still do some stuff from the back row thanks to his ninjutsu, which functions kind of like black and white magic. He has access to elemental group attacks and some minor buffs, but as you would expect from a red mage, he's worse at buffing than Rosa and worse at offense than Rydia. The last bit of utility that Edge brings to the table is the steal command, which allows him to potentially steal items from foes. But I didn't find this to be all that useful. Steal rates in the early Final Fantasy games are pretty low, but Edge felt like he was particularly bad at pickpocketing. And unless I missed something, there are no unique and powerful items that you can only get through stealing. Instead, it mostly serves as a way to refresh on consumables. But in a game like FF4, gold isn't really in limited supply, so I didn't see stealing as useful. Well, outside of one gimmick fight that makes it have an entirely different function from normal. But we'll get to that soon, because Edge is not letting his vendetta go. He needs to kill Rubicante to avenge his parents, and by extension, his people and kingdom. With that in mind, Edge shows us a back door into the Tower of Babil. And so now we can once again try to steal the 7 crystals back from Golbez. Along the way, however, we run into Edge's parents. They're alive? And they ask Edge to come with them. To hell? Yeah, Edge's mom and dad are monsters now, and you get launched into a, well, not quite a boss fight, more of a pseudo-cinematic where you are in control. After a set amount of time, no matter how much damage you've dealt, Edge's parents will give their tearful goodbyes and die. And then Edge is once again left sad and orphaned. Although, given the monstrosities that his parents turned into, his desire for revenge has been redoubled. Not only were they killed, but their memories were disrespected. And I'm sure this is meant to be an emotional scene, but I'll be honest, I kinda didn't give a shit. We were only just introduced to Edge like 5 minutes ago, and he's been an insufferable asshole the whole time. Yeah, it sucks that his mom and dad died, but plenty of people are orphans, and most of them aren't dickheads about it. Some of them become Batman. But the writers seem convinced that you will like Edge, which is why the next plot beat also revolves around him, as we need to fight Rubicante, the final Elemental Archfiend. Unlike the other fiends, Rubicante is presented as somewhat civilized and honorable. He says that he wasn't the one who turned Edge's parents into monsters, and he's actually disgusted at Dr. Luge for doing so. He also gives your party a full heal before the fight begins because he wants to duel under fair conditions. The fight itself also revolves around Edge as a party member. Upon initiating the battle, Edge learns a bunch of new ninjutsu moves, although the real way that he's useful is through the Steel command, as Rubicante will prepare a massive fire spell with his cloak, and Edge can use Steel in order to throw him off guard and cancel the spell. Whether or not that makes this qualify as a gimmick fight is up to you, but it's basically the only time the Steel command will be useful in the rest of the story. And the same can be said for Edge as a character, because now that we've killed Rubicante, he kind of doesn't have a reason to exist. He sticks with the party because we're trying to stop the world from getting destroyed or whatever, but in the span of about 10 minutes, we were introduced to Edge, got his entire character arc, and now he's just sort of an asshole who hangs out with us? I don't know, maybe it's just me, but I really don't like this character. He contributes nothing else to the story besides just being an asshole to everyone older than him and occasionally hitting on Rydia. And it's weird because it feels like there was room to do more with him after he accomplished his revenge. Rubicante initially says Edge is not a worthy opponent because he's too emotional, but Edge doesn't do anything to confront that character flaw. He remains a hothead whenever he pipes up in conversation, and nobody even calls him out on it. Given that Tellah's story ends with the idea that revenge is what led to his downfall, it would have been neat to see Edge, who accomplished his revenge, still have to work on himself afterwards. Revenge didn't bring his parents back, and he's still an emotional brat, so rather than being the end of his character arc, it should have served as the beginning. But instead, we end up with these kind of conflicting messages. For Tellah, revenge was bad and deadly, but for Edge, revenge was good. I don't know, maybe I'm missing something. Let me know in the comments what you thought of Edge, and if there's anything from his character arc that particularly spoke out to you. And while you're down there, consider giving it a like, subscribe, all that YouTube stuff. I mean, you've been watching this video for 3 hours, right? So it's gotta be a little bit enjoyable. But shameless plug out of the way, we have a mission to do. So the gang heads down to the crystal room, and surprise, there's a trapdoor, and they fall down it. And falling through the trap seems to trigger some sort of alarm, so we need to flee the Tower of Babil ASAP. Thankfully, there is a docked and unmanned Red Wing ship that we can just steal for ourselves. We christen our newfound boat the Falcon, and now we've got an airship named after the Enterprise, as well as an airship named after the Millennium Falcon. And given just how much Final Fantasy IV will steer into the sci-fi genre in the third act, I think this makes sense. Traditionally, Final Fantasy has referenced a lot of mythological and fantasy figures, so it's only logical to include sci-fi icons in that same lexicon. But with our mission to recover the crystals an utter failure, we decide to meet up with the only guy who's a bigger loser than us, King Groit of the Dwarves. And he decides to once again demonstrate his idiocy, because, as he explains, Golbez cannot get the 8th crystal so long as it is safe in the sealed cave. So he's going to unseal the sealed cave and send us down there to recover the 8th crystal, so that we can keep it safe from Golbez by taking it out of the location where it's safe from Golbez. Do you see where I might have a bit of an issue with this plan? You absolute fucking moron. Whatever, let's just get on with it. But before we need to upgrade our airship, because the Falcon isn't capable of going over lava. Thankfully, if we visit the Dwarf's Infirmary, we can find Cid, who's getting a little bit of rest since he exploded a few minutes ago. Edge, of course, makes fun of him for being old because Edge is an asshole, and then Cid decides to upgrade our ship. His doctors warn him that if he pushes himself too hard, he's probably going to die, since he needs to rest off his injuries. But Cid ignores their warnings because he's the only one who's capable of upgrading the Falcon. And so he does it, and then he collapses after putting in too much strenuous effort. The sad music plays, and then it turns out he was just asleep, and he started snoring because he was a sleepy bear. So Cid gets 2 fake-out deaths. The second one is pretty clearly played as a joke, so part of me wonders if the devs knew that Yang and Cid's fake-out deaths were kind of dumb and decided to just lampshade it, but honestly, I don't think that makes it better. I know that from a technical perspective, the reason they needed to have these fake deaths is to remove these characters from the party, but couldn't Cid have just decided he was going to permanently pilot the airship and be removed from the party that way? And as for Yang, I don't know, maybe he stubbed his toe really hard, and so since he can't use the kick command, he's unable to do combat. Whatever, I've already got an earlier rant about the fake out deaths, so I don't want to retread that ground, when there is, unfortunately, so much more I could complain about, because we are about to enter a Final Fantasy II dungeon. If you've seen my video on Final Fantasy II, you'll know that I'm a defender of that game for the most part, but the one aspect I can't defend is the dungeon design. Every dungeon in that game is just a maze with a series of pick-a-door situations like Baby's first Mario Maker level. And if you pick the wrong door, you get launched into a trap room with an absurdly high encounter rate. I thought that was as bad as dungeon design could get in Final Fantasy, but FF4 has shown me that they can get even worse. Because the sealed cave brings back the trap rooms, dead ends, and pick a door situation, but it adds an additional mechanic. Every single door in the dungeon is a trap door, which is a mimic enemy that you must fight before traveling through the door. At the start of the encounter, the trap door will select one of your party members to target, and then after a charge up time, they will instantly kill that party member before choosing a new one. The idea behind this is if you don't want to spend a bunch of Phoenix Downs and revival spells, you need to race against the clock to kill the trapdoor before it kills your party member. Although, since it declares what its attack is going to be, you can also use the reflect spell to bounce the instant kill attack back at the trapdoor. And in theory, this should be pretty cool, since it rewards you for intuitive thinking and taking full advantage of the game's systems. But in practice, it gets really tiring after the first time you do it, because every single door in this extremely long dungeon has the same encounter. So you're either spamming basic attacks to try to get them off as quickly as possible, or using the same reflect trick if you figured that out. And either way, it's not a terribly engaging dungeon crawl. Making things worse, the sealed cave also has an absurdly high encounter rate. So even just walking from door to door would see me fighting vamp ladies and bats ad nauseum. And it's possible I was under-leveled, but it seemed like there were a larger than normal number of ambushes and back attacks, which just made combat even more tedious. The boss of Sealed Cave is also one of the least interesting gimmick fights. It's called the Demon Wall, and it's just got a huge chunk of HP. It slowly advances towards your party, and if it ever reaches you, it will instantly kill everyone. But other than that, you just have to continuously hammer it with your strongest attacks in hopes of wearing down its massive HP bar. Similar to the Mist Dragon, this is the sort of gimmick fight that could only really exist under the ATB system, but it doesn't exactly sell me on the merits of ATB because it's a pretty fucking boring fight. But now that we have the 8th crystal and we're heading out of the cave, suddenly, Kain shifts. He's been traveling with us this whole time as a double agent for Golbez, because as it turns out, the brainwashing spell was never actually broken, and thusly, Tellah's sacrifice is retroactively rendered even more futile than it initially was. With his true nature revealed, Kain now takes the crystal and returns it to Golbez, who in turn will be able to climb the Tower of Babil to reach the moon. And so it looks like we've failed. But there is one possible last-ditch effort that we can undertake. You see, the Elder of Mysidia knows of an ancient and powerful airship called the Lunar Whale, which is actually strong enough to travel from Earth to the Red Moon. And so our 4 heroes climb aboard the whale and fly up to the moon in hopes of stopping whatever Golbez has planned before he can accomplish it. This is the part of the video where I would insert a Futurama joke if I wasn't terrified of getting copyright struck by Fox. Now that we're on the moon, the obvious point of plot progression is the giant crystal palace in the center of the map. However, there are a few side caverns we can explore. One of them is an optional super dungeon that you need to complete to get the strongest summon in the game, Bahamut, but it is definitely not worth the trouble. You have to fight a ton of optional strong bosses, and eventually on the lower floors of the dungeon, some of those bosses are just treated like regular enemies. And summon magic isn't even particularly useful against the few remaining bosses we have. For that reason, I'm much more interested in the other optional side cave, the one populated by a civilization full of rabbits. However, it's worth noting this isn't the only time we've encountered talking rabbits. In basically every city we've been to so far, there's been a bloke named Namingway. And he has a unique mechanic tied to him, the ability to change your party members' names. You see, in the previous Final Fantasies, your characters didn't actually have fixed names. Even FF2, which eventually retroactively named them Firion, Maria, and Guy, let you choose your cast's names at the start of the campaign. But since FF4 has a much more focused story, it gave its party members canonical names from the get-go. Presumably, Squaresoft was afraid there would be backlash at the lack of party customization if you couldn't rename Cecil and Rosa, so they decided to add Namingway. As for why a rabbit from the moon was chosen to help characters change their name, well, that's because that's how it works in real life. If you're transing your gender and you want to get rid of your dead name, a rabbit from the moon will show up at your doorstep to assist. It's also worth noting that some parts of Japanese mythology feature moon rabbits making mochi, so that probably explains where the rest of the colony comes from. But with that history lesson out of the way, we should probably head for the Crystal Palace, since there is a massive lore dump waiting for us. In the Crystal Palace, we run across an old man named Fusoya. Well, describing him as an old man isn't entirely accurate because he's not actually a human. Fusoya is a Lunarian, and he explains to us basically everything motivating the conflict in FF4. You see, the Lunarians are an alien species that lived on a planet that was destroyed a long time ago. They enacted a mass migration to Gaia, the game's setting, in hopes of making it their new home planet. However, they found that humans had not evolved enough to coexist with an alien race, and as such, they decided to enter a form of artificial hibernation known as the Lunar Sleep until such time as the humans evolved and they could coexist with Lunarians. However, one of these Lunarians, Zemus, objected to this plan, positing that the more reasonable course of action would be complete and total genocide of the human race. And as such, he constructed the Giant of Babil, which is a robot intended to kill all life on the planet. Horrified by this, the other Lunarius forcibly put Zemus into a lunar sleep. And while everyone else hibernated, Fusoya stayed awake to be a guardian watching over him. However, Zemus's hatred was so strong that even in a forced coma, it seeped into the world. And in his sleep, he was able to mind control Golbez in order to do his bidding. As such, Golbez has not actually been the villain this whole time, but he was instead Zemus's first victim. I actually really like how this twist recontextualizes the antagonist we've been fighting for basically the entire campaign. And clearly I'm not the only one, because over a decade later, the Mass Effect devs did the same thing with their first villain, Saren. Although, as much as I like the story of Mass Effect, I genuinely think this twist works better for Golbez than it did for Saren. Because with Golbez being controlled and manipulated by a larger force, he draws a direct parallel to Cecil's behavior at the beginning of the story. After all, Cecil was sort of blindly following the King of Barron's orders, even if it meant doing things that he knew were wrong. He may not have been literally magically brainwashed, but to some extent, he gave up his free will in order to become a more perfect soldier. If you want to stretch the parallel even further, because the king had been replaced by Cognazzo, and Cognazzo was working for Golbez, who was working for Zemus, then indirectly, Cecil was also being manipulated by Zemus at the start of the game. The similarities and differences between Golbez and Cecil are the big focus of the closing act of the game, so I have no doubt that this parallel was intentional by the writers. This twist does unfortunately have the side effect of making the game's true antagonist, Zemus, something of a non-character, but I honestly think that's fine, because Golbez is still an extremely effective antagonist, even if he wasn't ultimately the head honcho. It's sort of like how everyone remembers Darth Vader and Emperor Palpatine is kinda just an afterthought. This isn't the only reveal Fusoya gives during his exposition dump. He also talks about another Lunarian, Kluya, who traveled down to Earth in order to share technology with them. He's the one who first taught humans how to create airships, and he also created other artifacts such as the Devil's Road teleporter, or the Lunar Whale, which Cecil and company used to travel to the moon. Eventually, Kluya met a woman and fell in love, having a child, and as it turns out, that child was Cecil, revealing that our protagonist is actually half Lunarian, and the voice that spoke to him when he was becoming a paladin was Kluya. In the background of the story, there has been a prophecy about the son of a dragon who's gonna save the world, and Cecil's adventure fits that prophecy to a T. This is keeping with Final Fantasy's tradition, as the first and third Final Fantasies had you controlling the four heroes of light, following a prophecy that they would save the world. So it makes sense that Cecil would similarly be prophesized, and that the fact he's a son of an alien would be interpreted as the son of a dragon. But I'll be honest, this is the aspect of the story I like the least. I'm not a huge fan of Chosen One narratives, although I think they can be done well, but in Cecil's case, since his story and character arc are all about growing and overcoming his own flaws, it feels like it does him a bit of a disservice to say that he was destined to do this all along. Kind of undercuts his agency in taking the path of virtue instead of vice. Any story with a prophecy is inevitably going to raise questions about the existence of free will in that world. Meanwhile, stories about redemption are very much about characters' choices. So the two forces feel like they are in conflict, and I much prefer the redemption tale. But despite my issues, the prophecy doesn't come anywhere near ruining this tale, since it exists primarily in the background and is very ignorable. I mean, I've recapped almost all of the plot without mentioning it until now. And Cecil's Lunarian lineage will become relevant later down the line. But we can't really worry about it at the moment, because since Golbez has all of the crystals and is being controlled by Zamus, he is going to use them to awaken the Giant of Babil, an evil robot that lives inside the Tower of Babil and exists just to destroy all life on the planet. With no time to waste, Fusoya joins our party so we can rush down to the surface in hopes of preventing this calamity. And as our 12th and final party member, Fusoya is decidedly fine? Since they've mined most of the traditional Final Fantasy jobs, Fusoya is basically a retread of Tellah, but without the gameplay story integration of limited MP. He's capable of casting both black and white magic, and can be a boon in combat for the few fights that you have him, but is almost always going to be your least effective unit, in part because he's just incredibly frail, so he spends a lot of his life as a puddle on the ground. Fusoya does also get access to one special command, the Renew ability, but this isn't particularly useful during the endgame. It grants a regenerating HP effect to every member of the party, but the amount of HP that you regain is so limited that it feels like a waste of his turn. I'd rather just use a cure spell and group target everyone than have this slow ticking clock of regeneration. Still, Fusoya has a flexible enough spell list that he can find a way to contribute in basically every fight, but he's never going to be an all-star. If you want an extra mage for the optional super dungeon, this is your only chance to do it, but otherwise we can head down to the planet's surface, where we witness horrified as the Giant of Babil awakens. All of our allies from throughout the adventure come together to battle this thing. The dwarves show up in their tanks, and there's a fleet of airships led by Cid. Yang is here as well, so if you didn't side quest and discover him, this is the reveal that he's still alive. And Mysidian mages have come to lend their support as well, along with Porum and Palom, as the Elder of Mysidia has figured out a way to de-petrify them. Even Edward is here, lending his strength to the cause. But unfortunately, despite the combined forces of the entire planet, this robot is seemingly invincible. And Fusoya explains that we're going to have to destroy it from the inside out. Our allies give us an opening, and we go inside the Giant of Babil, which is a robotic dungeon. Our goal is to reach the core of this giant and destroy the CPU. However, there's a major obstacle in our way. Somehow, the 4 elemental fiends have returned, and so we are forced into a gauntlet of rematches one after another. In some ways, this boss fight is unremarkable since it's just 4 people we already defeated, but despite this, I actually think it offers a pretty interesting gameplay experience, since each individual lord highlights the strengths of a different party member. As an undead abomination, Scarlamione is weak to Cecil and Rosa, but against Cognazo, it's Rydia and Fusoya's time to shine, as they'll blast him with elemental attacks. The Barbarisha rematch is also interesting because it highlights how Kain's absence has affected the party. Without access to the jump command, physical attacks are useless, so Edge and Cecil are on item duty, while your mages blast away at her, although less effectively than Kain would. And as a finale, Rubicante, the hardest of the 4 fiends, is once again countered by careful use of Edge's steal ability. As such, I think this battle accomplishes 3 pretty worthwhile things. It highlights the trials that you already overcame, it does a good job of emphasizing your teammates' strengths, and it makes you feel bad about Kain's absence, since Barbarisha is incredibly difficult, much more so than during her first fight. But with the fiends permanently slain, there's nothing standing between the party and the computer that will shut down the Giant of Babil. Unfortunately, we don't have any tech experts here, so we're going to have to do this the old-fashioned way, by punching the machine until it stops working. For the penultimate boss battle, this is a pretty weird encounter. You end up facing against the CPU core and its two nodes, the attack node and defense node. The core is the main boss with a massive HP bar, and it spams the reflect spell to make black magic functionally useless in this fight. The attack node and defense node, on the other hand, are assisting the CPU in your demise. Attack node deals significant damage, while the defense node constantly heals the computer. And though these nodes have lower HP than the CPU, taking them out is not actually all that advisable, because if both of them are dead, the CPU will counterattack with a strong strike, almost guaranteed to kill one or two of your party members, and then instantly regenerate the nodes, thus undoing any progress you did. As such, the optimal strategy is to destroy either the defense node to cut off the healing, or the attack node to lessen the damage you take, and then focus fire on the CPU. Which means you can't really use summon magic either, because summon spells are almost all group-wide, and therefore will wipe out whichever node you left alive. This makes Rydia, and to some extent Fusoya, feel a little bit underwhelming in this fight. And on the one hand, I understand giving late-game bosses countermeasures for magic, but I think this goes a bit too far. And especially in conjunction with the mechanics of the final boss, which once again send Rydia to the sidelines, I wasn't really a fan of Final Fantasy IV's late game. At least from a gameplay perspective, because as a story, FF4 continues to hit it out of the park. You see, after destroying the computer, we are once again confronted by Golbez and Kain. However, rather than taking the path of violence, this time Fusoya goes over to Golbez and tries to help him remember who he is. By channeling all of his magical energy, Fusoya is able to break Zemus's spell, and Golbez remembers that he's not just some evil man working to destroy the world, but is the son of Kluya, and therefore is Cecil's brother. Fusoya reveals that the reason Golbez was chosen by Zemus was his Lunarian blood, and Cecil wonders aloud why they chose his brother instead of him. To which Golbez responds that Zemus could see the seeds of evil inside of him, and just coaxed them to grow a little bit more, feeding that hatred until it was all too easy to push Golbez to do the wrong thing. For the most part, I like this reveal, as it makes both Golbez and Kain accountable to some extent for the actions they took while hypnotized. Each of them have some darkness inside of them that was simply brought to the surface by Zemus's influence. And as such, while the game is understanding that their choices were not entirely their own, it also holds the characters accountable for the evil they did under Zemus's influence. As such, Zemus's mind control feels a little bit like an inebriant. Yeah, if someone does a bad thing while they're drunk, there's some amount of understanding, but at the same time, they are still accountable for their own actions. And both Kain and Golbez feel that they have some amount of redemption to work towards paralleling Cecil, and I always love when a villain's arc parallels the hero's. This also means that even with the mind control reveal, Golbez can still feel like an effective villain since he's not fully divorced from his actions. In contrast, the most recent Fire Emblem story, Engage, also had the major antagonist Vale be mind-controlled for the majority of the story, but in this case, as soon as the spell is broken, everyone instantly forgives her and there's no tension between your army and Vale. And this always annoyed me because not only were you all fighting against Vale for the majority of the campaign, But she also is directly responsible for killing Alir's mother and Ivy and Hortensia's father. I don't want to dwell too much on Engage's story, since that horse has been beaten to death by the Fire Emblem community, but it was the most immediate comparison that came to mind for me, and it really helped highlight why I'm a fan of FF4's approach of mind control, while I normally dislike this trope. That being said, there is one aspect of this that I disagree with. It's heavily implied and basically outright stated that Zemus chose Golbez because he had darkness in his heart, whereas Cecil didn't. But this is just categorically untrue and honestly flies in the face of the themes of FF4. Cecil did, in fact, have darkness in his heart. He followed the orders of the King of Barron and massacred the people of Mysidia in order to steal the water crystal. His entire character arc of going from being a Dark Knight to a Paladin hinges on the idea that he initially started out as a flawed individual. And so I think the implication that he didn't have enough darkness for Zemus to control is pretty misguided. And similarly to the prophecy, it feels like it undercuts Cecil's agency in a way that kind of frustrates me. Anyway, now that the brainwashing spell has been broken, Golbez decides he's going to get revenge on Zemus for turning him into a puppet. So he sets off to the moon to confront the evil Lunarian, accompanied by Fusoya. Kain, meanwhile, asks to rejoin Cecil's party. He says that he doesn't expect to be forgiven for everything he did, but he still wants to help in whatever way he can to save the world. Edge immediately rejects this, and I just gotta say, who the fuck asked you, Edge? God, I really hate this character. Honestly, Edge feels like when a sitcom enters its final season, but it can't get back all of the core cast members, so they introduce a new person like Randy from That 70s Show, or fucking Pete from The Office, and nobody likes these characters, but for some reason the show acts like they are now the focus of all the attention and that they've been here this whole time. But it's just like, no, who the fuck asked you, Edge? Get the fuck out of the final party. I would much rather have Kain and Fusoya. But whatever, despite Edge's protests, Cecil lets Kain join the party, and they agree they're going to travel to the moon. Although, not before an incredibly weird scene that serves no purpose other than highlighting Final Fantasy IV's strange attitudes towards women. Because Cecil requests that Rydia and Rosa stay on Earth while the boys travel to the moon, as he doesn't want to put them in any more danger. I once again want to emphasize that the only person who should be asked to stay behind is fucking Edge, but okay, we gotta show that Cecil is protective of his allies and that he loves Rosa, and I can even kind of understand Rydia because she was a child and he was protecting her during the beginning of the game, so it's like, you know, advancement of his character arc or whatever, but honestly, this scene it really feels like the women are delicate, must be protected, men fight on the front lines, and it really just feels like a retread of the same thing that happened during the invasion towards the beginning of the game, where Edward, Yang, and Cecil were the only ones allowed to fight. I'm sure that to some extent the intention was to tie things in with Cecil's character growth, since protecting the innocent or helpless is a big part of the Paladin's role within gameplay and Cecil's role within the story. But it really it rubs me the wrong way, and it doesn't even have any gameplay ramifications. Because Rosa and Rydia leave, but then when the lunar whale moves to the moon, they reveal that they'd actually only been hiding and they never left at all, because this is their fight too, and they're gonna see it through to the bloody end. Which I appreciate, it just feels like an unnecessary addition to the story. But now it's time for the final dungeon, and this is a doozy. We must descend through the depths of the Lunar Subterain until we reach the very center of the moon, where we can confront Zemus. However, getting down there is easier said than done, because foes in the Lunar Subterrain are absurdly difficult to fight. Many of the standard enemy encounters are functionally bosses, and some of them even fit into the standard gimmick boss layout. There's sages that cast high damage spells, Selene Guardians who petrify your allies, silver and gold dragons who are not only massive HP sponges, but hit you very hard, and of course the gold dragon counters any attack by paralyzing a random party member, and Armen, who was a certified boss in Final Fantasy III, makes his return in FF4 only to continuously cast Doom and Confuse on your party members. It's kind of just a miserable slog, but that's not even the worst of it. The last few floors of this dungeon have their own unique hellish enemy encounter tables. Behemoth has 16,000 HP, is functionally immune to magic damage, and counters all of your physical attacks with a strike that is strong enough to kill most party members. Zemus's mind, on the other hand, is functionally immune to physical damage, requiring you to spend a ton of MP if you want to whittle it down. Evil Mask, on the other hand, automatically casts Reflect and then spams high-powered spells in order to make your day miserable. Thankfully, FF4 has a very generous runaway system, and almost any fight can be escaped with little to no consequences, but I don't really think that excuses this abysmal enemy design. I think it's the sign of a bad system when the best thing about it is you don't have to engage with it. But after the long ordeal that is the Lunar Subterrain, we have our final confrontation with Zemus. As we show up, Golbez and Fusoya confront Zemus and fairly easily defeat him with a meteor spell. However, this is not the end of the confrontation. Zemus's hatred is so strong that it manifests as its own being, Zeromus. And Zeromus is far more powerful than Zemus was. It easily shrugs off all of the attacks from Golbez and Fusoya, so Golbez tries in vain to use a crystal to weaken Zeromus. But since Golmus's heart is tainted by darkness still, the crystal has no effect. And Zeromus casts his own meteor spell, which not only knocks out Golbez, but also defeats Cecil's entire party. It's looking like the end for our band of heroes. But in classic JRPG fashion, we get some help from all of the allies we met along the way, praying for us and granting us their strength from far away. And now that we're backed by the power of friendship, Cecil is ready to confront Zeromus. So, Golbez offers the crystal to Cecil, since Cecil has overcome his inner demons and therefore can use the crystal to weaken Zeromus and put him in a vulnerable form. Once you use the crystal, the fight proper begins. And it is ass. Absolute fucking butt cheeks. This fight is garbage. He spends the majority of the encounter spamming a spell called Big Bang, which does massive non-elemental damage to the entire party and risks one or two-shotting every member. As such, Rosa is basically permanently occupied spamming group cast Kiraja in order to keep everyone out of two-shot range. But honestly, that's probably for the best, because any of her buffing moves wouldn't really be effective anyway, as Zemus also frequently casts Black Hole, which negates all status effects, either positive or negative, for both him and the party. So that 99 stack of spider silk that you've been hoarding for the entire campaign, yeah, it's basically useless. You can't really slow down Zeromus in any way that functionally matters. So instead, the fight becomes a tedious routine of edge throwing, Kain jumping, Cecil attacking, and Rydia probably lying on the ground dead, because she's got low enough HP that she gets one-shot by Big Bang. But if Rydia is alive, she can't really make use of her magic, because anytime Zeromus is hit with a spell, he'll counter with his own powerful spell, such as Flare or Bio, and usually this, in combination with Big Bang, is enough to knock out even your toughest party members. The fight itself is very long and overwhelming, but it's not exactly what I would call hard, just, well, tedious. You end up clicking the same commands over and over with almost no variance. It's arguably worse than the last boss of Final Fantasy III because at least there you could make use of your spellcasters. But here you've got a fixed party and one of them is functionally useless. And the lack of tactical depth in the final encounter of the campaign brings me to probably my biggest frustration with Final Fantasy IV. If you are approaching this from a pure gameplay perspective and don't care about the story at all, Final Fantasy IV is actually a pretty bad game. While it's definitely at the most egregiously noticeable in the final boss fight, the majority of encounters, whether they be standard enemies or bosses in FF4, are dispatched by spamming your character's most powerful attack. For some characters, this is just the attack button, but even more complex fighters like Kain functionally just have jump replace basic attack, since jump is almost always better than the attack button. And even your mages, for the most part, just spam their highest level offensive spell, which again just feels like a replacement for the attack button. Sometimes you'll also have to throw healing in the mix, but otherwise, this is just a spam A simulator. If you encounter a boss that you don't think you can beat, rather than changing up your strategy, the best course of action is to go grind, because this game doesn't really have any strategic depth to allow for changes in strategy. I've talked about this issue a few times, but I think if an RPG just requires you to spam attack and heal, it's a bad RPG. And I've gotten some pushback on this, so I want to expand on what I mean by it. On a technical level, almost every RPG can be boiled down to 3 or 4 functions. You attack, you heal, you buff, and sometimes you inflict statuses. And to that extent, every RPG falls into the just spam attack and heal variety. However, I do think there are ways in which the genre can allow for more strategic complexity. The first is by creating a battle system which dynamically shifts what is the best available course of action, and the second is by giving the player a wide variety of choices in terms of character build, team composition, and other forms of preparation. Ideally, a game would include both, but honestly, either one of these changes it from a MASH A simulator to a genuine test of strategy. And these systems don't need to be the most complex or difficult to understand in order to add a strategic element to an otherwise bland genre. And to demonstrate this, I'm going to give examples of each of them in titles that are intended for children: the Pokemon series and the Paper Mario franchise. At their core, the first 2 Paper Mario games are primarily a test of your preparation, as throughout his adventure, Mario will collect a large number of badges which have different effects. Some of them boost his stats, some of them give him access to new powerful moves, and some of them provide him immunities from various statuses or enemy tactics. But you cannot equip all of these badges at once. Instead, there's a limit based on how many badge points you have. And as such, the primary skill being tested is how you combine different badge synergies to create a superpowered plumber who can take down any papery monster that stands in his way. The Pokemon series also has some amount of preparation in the way its team building works, but I think this is honestly a better example of how battles can be dynamic and updated throughout the fight. Pokemon's battle system primarily revolves around elemental weaknesses and resistances, so choosing the best attack to exploit your foe's typing is the main skill being tested. Although there is a bit more to it than the type chart, since you have options like Quick Attack for a guaranteed first strike, Swift for perfect accuracy, and the various stat raising or status inflicting moves that can cripple your opponent or buff your allies. Even though both Pokemon and Paper Mario have very simplistic systems, they do at least have systems, whereas Final Fantasy IV doesn't really test anything in terms of your tactical acumen. There's no depth of preparation since your party members are fixed for every point of the story, so you don't get any choice as to which characters would be best for which challenge. And while you technically can choose how you outfit your characters, in practice you really can't because equipment in Final Fantasy IV all scales linearly. There's no interesting choice between Quake Hammer and Power Jump, instead you just get Sword +1 and Sword +2. Where Sword +2 is obviously better. And as far as complexity in the moment-to-moment battle, that too is absent. Like I said, every character is just spamming their strongest generic attack. Even spellcasters, who theoretically should have deep toolkits, realistically are just hitting the same offensive spells. This was also a problem in the first 3 Final Fantasies, albeit to a slightly lesser extent. FF1 does technically let you choose your team at the beginning of the campaign, but that's the only bit of preparation you do, and it's not terribly complex. And FF3's job system seems like it gives you a lot of preparation complexity, but realistically, it's less than it appears, since for most encounters, there is a strictly correct choice. And the game often signposts this by making all other options functionally useless. Final Fantasy II probably has the most complexity in the way that you can prepare for battles by building your team in specific directions, but even here, the system is a lot shallower than it appears on the surface. I know that these are still relatively early RPGs and the genre was kind of figuring itself out even during the SNES era, so my hope is that as the franchise goes forward, Final Fantasy will get more experimental and allow for some more tactical choices, making for a more pleasant or at least more engaging gameplay experience. Because on that front, I think Final Fantasy IV really failed. But that's not me saying that Final Fantasy IV is a bad game. Sure, its gameplay is, in my opinion, pretty boring, but even so, this title held my attention much more than any other Final Fantasy before it. In fact, I was so enraptured that I played through the entire game twice in only a matter of days. And that's because Final Fantasy IV's biggest strength is its story. So let's look at the final cutscene before I wrap things up with some closing thoughts. With Zeromus defeated, Fusoya reconsiders the idea that humans need to evolve for Lunarians to live in peace with them, and decides that humans are actually more evolved than Lunarians. As such, he and his people are going to leave, and the Lunarians will never again interact with humans. You see, the Red Moon that most of the game's finale took place in is not actually a moon, but is instead the giant colony ship that the Lunarians used to escape their previous planet. So Fusoya is going to fly it away outside of Earth's orbit. At this point, Golbez decides to go with him. He doesn't feel that he's worthy of living on Earth amongst the people he caused so much suffering to, and instead wants to get to know his father's people. But before leaving, he asks if Cecil can forgive him. And in response, Cecil is completely silent, which gives Golbez the answer he expected. He caused too much suffering to be forgiven, even by his brother. However, as Golbez is saying goodbye, Cecil finally speaks up, and he says, "Goodbye, my brother." This is the first time in the entire story where Cecil has explicitly called Golbez his brother, and as such, it's a very meaningful gesture, and Golbez actually thanks him for this before leaving to never be seen again. I think this works really well as the emotional climax of the story and the end of both Cecil and Golbez's tales. Golbez has caused immeasurable harm to Cecil, people Cecil cares about, and even just random civilians. And just like Cecil can't erase his bad deeds with good ones, so too Golbez is not forgiven for his massacres just because he helped kill Zemus. But even after all of that, Golbez is still a person, and he deserves to be recognized as such and even given affection from people close to him. I like that Cecil doesn't say "I forgive you," and in fact, whether or not he forgives Golbez is left deliberately unclear. However, he does acknowledge him as his brother. And on some level, they have a pleasant goodbye, which is a much better way to end things than with anger and resentment. I'll be honest, I'm sure part of why this resonated with me so much was the timing of it. Without getting into too much personal stuff, around the time I was playing FF4, I was also trying to repair my relationship with my abusive parents. Unfortunately, that reconciliation didn't exactly go the way I would have liked, so getting to see this scene afterwards, where Golbez and Cecil somewhat reconcile, it hit me in a personal place, I'm not gonna lie. I think it's a really well done ending, with one exception. You see, there is one detail of this conversation I intentionally left out, and that is the fact that after Cecil is initially silent, Kain, Rosa, Edge, and Rydia all get mad at him and say he has to reconcile with his brother. I get that for some people and cultures, blood family is seen as incredibly important and something that you can never disregard, but personally, I think it makes this interaction a lot less meaningful because instead of Cecil recognizing someone who is on the same path to redemption that he once was, he instead is bullied into being nice to his brother because his friends think you gotta be nice to family members. In addition to my disagreeing with the idea that being related should overcome all sins, I also think that the bullying from his teammates means Cecil's actions feel like they have once again been taken out of his agency, and therefore it feels the same way to me as the prophecy. It's an element of the story that I would rather ignore when analyzing the themes, as I personally feel the emotional weight of the scene works much better if it were just an interaction between the two estranged brothers. But that's basically the end of Final Fantasy IV's narrative. All that we have left is an extended epilogue scene checking on the fates of all of our party members. Porum and Palom have gone back to training under the Elder, but while Porum is ever bit as disciplined and respectful as she used to be, Palom has doubled down on both his ego and his rebellious nature, as he skips lessons so he can brag to the other children about all of the spells he cast while saving the world. His sister Porum, of course, keeps him in line the only way that she knows how, with excessive violence. Edge has taken his rightful place as king, however, he's not a very good ruler. In fact, he's distracted from his duties purely with daydreaming about Rydia. Apparently, his only character traits are hating old men and being in love with Rydia, so I guess this cutscene tracks. For her part, Rydia has returned to the Land of Summons, and she seems to function like something of an ambassador between monsters and humans. This is honestly kind of a weird ending for her, in my opinion. As the last survivor of Mist, I thought it would have been cool for her to train up the next generation of summoners so as to keep her people's culture alive. But I'll be honest, she fell so out of the spotlight in the second half of the story that I kind of forgot about her existing. So I guess being ambassador to the monsters is good enough. Yang gets probably the most unhinged ending of all, because he has now been named king. I have no idea why this happened. Maybe Fabul culture just makes the strongest warrior into the king, but that was never explained, so it just feels like completely random. Also, the former king is just like standing next to the throne. Like, I don't know, is he sitting in the cuck chair? This whole situation is really weird, and it kind of just feels like they wanted to give Yang something, but it feels like it would be much more in line with his personality if he was just training the next generation of monks. Which he technically is, but he's also the king as like his side hustle. I don't fucking know. FF4's weird. Edward gets probably the most satisfying ending, as he is starting to rebuild Damcyan after the destruction from early in the story. He's also continuing to hone his bardly talents by singing the ballad of Cecil the Paladin. I'm probably somewhat biased because Edward is my favorite character, but I also think this is probably just the best ending of FF4, or at the very least it's tied with Kain's. Because everyone's favorite Dragoon has headed off to Mount Ordeals, as he is now beginning his own journey towards redemption. And he doesn't feel worthy of facing Cecil and Rosa until he can overcome his inner demons and become an even better Dragoon than his father was. It's for this reason that he and Fusoya are the only living playable characters absent from Cecil and Rosa's wedding, which is the final scene we get access to. Cecil has also been crowned King of Barron, although unlike Yang, I think this makes a certain amount of sense. After all, the former King of Barron is actually dead, unlike the King of Fabul, and even though Cecil was an orphan, he was raised by the king, so in the absence of any biological children, he makes sense as the next in the line of succession. As wedding bells play, we get to see all of the friendly faces from our journey celebrating the love of Rosa and Cecil, and then credits roll. That's it, the end of Final Fantasy IV. So yeah, in case it's not obvious, I think the story of this game is incredibly good. And despite debuting on the Super Nintendo, it still holds up by modern standards. It's not a perfect story. In fact, I feel like I've spent much of the last 4 hours criticizing the aspects I don't like. But the areas where it's strong are, in my opinion, strong enough to outweigh those downsides. The willingness to engage with a mature story centering a flawed protagonist going on a redemption arc is something that feels like a huge leap forward as compared to the tales of other RPGs or even other video games in general. And the fact that many side characters, such as my beloved Edward, had their own character arcs is just the frosting on top of this beautiful narrative cake. And as such, despite the fact that I really didn't care for the gameplay, I think Final Fantasy IV is a masterpiece that every RPG fan, and honestly most video game fans, should play. Because even if you don't end up connecting with the various themes and twists of Final Fantasy IV to the same degree that I did, it at the very least serves as a interesting historical artifact. Even role-playing games, which are a story-based genre, didn't put the story front and center to the extent that FF4 did until this time. And FF4 pioneered a lot of the video game storytelling techniques, in particular integrating narrative directly into the mechanics, so it feels like a bit of a foundational text. In that way, Final Fantasy IV almost feels comparable to something like Citizen Kane or Jaws, as those are films that might not necessarily seem as impressive to modern audiences, but pioneered filmmaking techniques that helped make other things possible. I mean, Citizen Kane basically invented the language of cinema. And while I wouldn't make quite as extreme a statement about Final Fantasy IV, I also wouldn't look at anyone funny if they did. Because while many modern titles have pushed the boundaries of how games do storytelling even further, they wouldn't exist without the classic titles that started it all, and I think Final Fantasy IV at the very least numbers amongst those titans. And given just how much I've glazed this title, it should be obvious where it's going to end up in my personal rankings. Out of the mainline titles I've played so far, Final Fantasy IV is easily the strongest. And I'll be honest, for the first time since starting this marathon, I understand why so many people were drawn to the Final Fantasy franchise. While it's true that each of the NES entries were groundbreaking for the time they released, looked at through a modern lens, they didn't exactly age the greatest. And I was beginning to wonder if this was a case of a franchise that was popular in the mainstream but simply wasn't going to click with me. Especially since that's exactly what happened with the last new RPG series I tried, Xenoblade Chronicles. Despite how many passionate fans there are of that franchise, neither the gameplay nor the story really worked for me. Although the OST is a fucking banger, and anyone who says otherwise has no taste in music. Thankfully, Final Fantasy IV has come along to assuage my fears, and shown me that this series is capable of telling phenomenal stories. And I'm hoping that a similar thing happens with FF5, only from a gameplay perspective. I don't know much about the Final Fantasy franchise, but one of the few things I'm aware of is FF5 really kicked the job system into high gear. And given my love for Bravely Default, Octopath Traveler, and Final Fantasy Tactics, I'm eager to dive into this next entry and see the game that pioneered the system. I mean, technically, you can argue that Final Fantasy III or even Final Fantasy I were the first games with a job system, but without sub-jobs, it really doesn't feel the same. There's just a lot less customization to it. Although, I'll be honest, don't expect the Final Fantasy V video to come anytime soon. The FF4 video took a lot longer than I expected because the project kind of ballooned in scale once I realized that I wanted to dive into the story as deeply as I have. I'm very happy with the final product, but it has definitely put me behind in my video workload. It's times like this that make me grateful I don't have to rely on YouTube's AdSense for my income. Instead, I can work on these larger projects at their own pace, and it's all because of the help of my patrons. So, without further ado, a huge thank you to Glupshido, Erica Ford, Perg Knight, YLO1, George Greenville the 7th PM, Jamie Collins, Arvis, Crispy Matthews, Floa Hay, Amy Hazel, Hungry Heart, Hound Dogs, Burnt to Cinders, Lovis Roman, Shinthia, Faulty Videos, Kyle Madison, Derek Williams, Anna Cabana, The Daily Fugal, Faye, Magic Bite, Thoughtful Insanity, Robin Goodfeller, JT Spritter, Laura Hunter, Ziggy WSB, Dicepike, Chris, Root Beer Pants, Queen Elizam, Control Alt Aegis, Roman Kormancic, Nick Knack Hammersmack, Carrier Has Left, Angel Nap Caceres, Zanwith, Not Gino, Flingon, Edward C, Cyrock 2, Cabbage, Caius Cole, Bree, Punch Fighter Champion, Eggman, Maxine the Vampire Queen, Sardonic Muse, Wesley Toma, Name Number 5, Femtol Illness, Wannabe Cinnabon, Punk Tattoo Guy, Key the Iron Idol, Calamity Callie, Jax McMahon, Saren Gurlixy, Rezi, Dino Anna, Andu, Rhea, Gameboo, Carosa, Fyrant, Your Doctor, Frozen Helm, Patwit, KH, Electric Giga, Girl Boss, Lizard Bongwater, Christopher Bueno, Marin McLean, Jaden, Dylan Solis, Some Trades, Guiji555, Smaz Ruby, Zycrom, Robin D, Alenby, Thaythom, Clan, Pillow Willow, Gabe the Green, and especially my Jagans, Him Roman, Alexander Roper, Lil Man, Sensitive Luigi, Adele, Siggy, KTRRK2, Autumn, and Dragonback Lancer. With 7 Jagans, what is this, Thracia? But seriously, I appreciate all of the support that everyone gives, whether it be paid support through Patreon, or just watching, subscribing, liking, and commenting on videos. It's people like you who give me the motivation to fight through chronic depression and release a 4-hour video essay on Final Fantasy IV. If you have the money to spare, please consider donating to my Patreon. You can get early access to things like this for only $3 a month, and there's other rewards at higher tiers, but please only donate if you can comfortably afford to do so. I don't want anyone going broke over Final Fantasy. It's funny because usually that catchphrase is I don't want anyone going broke over Fire Emblem, and people will point to Fire Emblem heroes, but it's even more egregious with Final Fantasy All the Bravest. Like, at least Heroes does fan service. Still, regardless of what you choose to do, I hope you have a wonderful day. Stay safe, gamers.